good input. And I think input needs to be improved. I think this board, as well as staff, needs to do a better job of not just telling people what they think staff council wants to hear, but telling them what they need to hear. There's a little bit of a dynamic dance that goes on between staff and council, and this is not just limited to OSMP, but I think that dynamic needs to be improved, and I can talk more about that probably outside of this 3 minutes. But an example of that is that I think okay, thanks. Let's move on to some recommendations then. Again, educate the council members, tell them what they need to hear. They're not experts. They ask, then they come up with questions, and staff narrowly responds to the questions instead of telling them more broadly what they need to hear. Example of the more broad is 70%, structural, ignition resistant, hardened homes to protect neighborhoods and the community. I would suggest that you affirmatively and visibly add that 70% metric into the CWPP and or the RIP, which I look forward to hearing more about later tonight. My understanding from the Colorado State Forest Service work is that Boulder is at the highest risk of a wildfire anywhere in the state. And its 10-year risk is between 50 and 80%. I don't think council knows that. And they shouldn't hear that first from community members. They should hear it from staff and or this board. We got to be close.
You are right now at 3 minutes.
Okay, so I'll forward my additional comments to you guys via email. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Charles.
Okay.
Thanks, Charles. Lynn, and then Carol has her hand raised, so we'll try her again after.
Up next, we have Lynn Siegel, who's online, and Lynn will be followed by Carol Maybach, also online. So Lynn, you should.
Oh, yeah, I'm gonna, Lynn, you should be able to unmute. I'll give you the same thing. I'll give you a 1-minute warning just because I'm doing the timer on my phone. Did we lose her? Okay, we're gonna come back to Lynn.
Okay, Lynn, we'll come back to you, and Carol, we'll try this again if you're able to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Wonderful,
Yeah.
thank you.
You can hear this?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry, I am not professional at this. I just happen to live by open space right underneath the NCAR building. And I am very concerned about all of the cuts that have gone to NCAR and to NOAA this year, and particularly concerned about the federal land that surrounds both of those areas in light of the fact that the president has commented that he's interested in selling public lands. Do we have a plan as a Boulder community to be able to save these beautiful, historic, iconic viewpoints around those very important buildings in the Boulder community? This is more of a question than it is some kind of a comment. I just would like to know what the process is, and also if we have a budget with the open space people that would be able to take a look at perhaps buying that from the federal government, or if there's some other aspect of the city services that can appropriate that land to save it as open space. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Carol.
Michelle's left a note about seeing council.
Yeah, there's cameras upstairs.
Yes, they fixed upstairs, so we could, if there is a break, we could decide whether or not to move up, but for that, okay, next was Lynn Siegel.
Next was Lynn. She was having some technical difficulties. She had messaged us. She's not yet back online. So
One option would be we can go back up to council chambers, give Lynn a chance to get back online, and then we'll either hear from her, or we'll close public comment, and move to the next item.
Are we sure that the council chambers work though?
That is what IT just told us, so. we
and
need
we're
to go
seeing
join.
that the cameras, the issue that was earlier, the cameras are back on and we're still connected to it.
Yeah, I think logistically it makes sense to head back up there if things are working. Right, so should we do that?
Yep.
And go on up?
You're pause.
Okay.
Pause.
9 o'clock.
Okay, so now that we're back in chambers, I will gavel the meeting back to order. We are back in order. And we are on public comment. Do we have any members of the public signed up to speak?
We had Lynn raise her hand, but it appears she's dropped back off. And there is a phone number, if that happens to be Lynn or somebody else, they can press *9 or press raise hand.
Okay, we'll give that a 10 count. And then I'm going to close public comment. Okay, public comment's closed. We're now on the fourth item on the agenda, which is matters from the board. Let me just open it up to my fellow board members for any general matters or news items that you want to bring up before we go to written information. Anything? Michelle? Nope.
Michelle there?
No.
It's Michelle. Oh, there she is. Hi, Michelle. Okay, I think Michelle said no, so then let's go to trustee questions or discussion on the written information memos or any response to public comment. First of all, is there anybody who wants to respond to any of the public comment?
Is there any reason we have, sorry. Do we have any reason to believe that there's any federal land in and around Boulder County that might be sold other than just the general threat from the?
We are unaware of any sign that federal lands will be put up to sell. I would just say that staff, along with Boulder County staff, there are a few significant pieces that we're always interested in, Table Mountain being another one. If something did become apparent, we would, especially at the NCAR site, we would definitely start making contacts and looking into that. As the city, there would be several resources we can consider. Bonding would be one. We actually have approval, open space has approval for additional up to $10 million worth of bonding authority. That's a citywide decision. We would have to look at where we're at with bonding across the city in order to consider that. We have some small money in our reserves. There's also, probably wouldn't work with a federal agency, but BUMPA, which is a Boulder Municipal Property Authority, which is sort of a purchasing arm for the city. So there are several tools that we could deploy if something imminent became available and it was a high priority for the city.
Thank you.
Well, do you have something, Sarah?
Yeah, I really appreciated I just wanted to say you're welcome and thank you for the appreciation coming from the Shanahan and also Flagstaff members here. And we're going to be talking a lot about fire today, so I'll just leave it there.
And it doesn't appear that we have any written items that we're not having a presentation on, so I think we can probably move on to the first public hearing item.
Just one additional for Susan's comment about ignition prevention. We will be giving an update on OSMP's ignition prevention project next month. So if anyone's interested in that issue, we'll provide a short presentation and update on that issue at the July OSBT meeting.
Hey, thanks for the heads up on that, Dan. So I'll turn it back to you then.
All right, we actually have two public items, public hearing items in which our real estate staff will be addressing both of them. So we'll keep them up at the dais. The first one is an acquisition of mineral rights holding under a significant piece of open space. This actually dates back to my original year here, in which this was a acquisition in which our staff back then was in the process of trying to see if we could negotiate an acquisition. So it's been on our minds for many, many, many years. One of the reasons why that we hold a small acquisition reserve in our budget is to, if some of our ongoing acquisitions that we were interested in that haven't come to fruition, if they would pop, quote unquote, that we would be able to move on them. That's sort of the purpose behind our reserves. One of those opportunities of something that we've been eyeing for some time has become available, and Bethany and her staff have been working hard. So to give you a little bit more details, I'll turn it over to our senior manager of our real estate work group, Bethany Collins.
Thanks, Dan. He gave a lot of my presentation, so no. It's great to be back a couple months in a row. Good evening, trustees. This agenda item is a rather unique item in that it is consideration of the acquisition of a large holding of mineral interests. The memo in your packet provides quite a few details of this proposed acquisition. So I'll take this short presentation as an opportunity to highlight some of the information in there and also answer any questions you might have. Next slide, please. So let's begin with some general background on severed mineral interests. Many of you have previously heard our bundle of sticks analogy when we were speaking related to property rights with conservation easement restrictions. So here, the subsurface mineral rights are one of the sticks that can be leased or sold separate from the surface rights of the property. Generally, the city has been able to acquire some or all of the subsurface mineral interests as part of our open space land acquisitions, which helps to control development that would cause detrimental impacts. However, we have also acquired properties over the years where the mineral rights were not included or where there have been existing oil and gas operations, leasing, or mining reclamation activities. In those cases, we've been able to work with lessees and operators to mitigate and restore impacts of their activities. Next slide. So in this proposed acquisition, the city would acquire approximately 5,840 net mineral acres of mineral interests under the lands owned by the city, Boulder County, and other entities, including portions of the Flatiron Vista, Greenbelt Plateau, and Marshall Mesa complexes. Open space staff acknowledges it is somewhat unusual to acquire mineral interests that lie under Boulder County and privately owned properties, including properties within Louisville and Superior. However, Teton's offer to sell is as a complete package. Open space staff have reached out to staff with staff and leadership with Boulder County, Louisville, and Superior, who have offered their general support and have not expressed any concern or opposition to the city's proposed acquisition. We've also heard they currently do not have the funds or priority to partner on this acquisition. As well, the city can also consider charter-guided disposal of those interests to these agency partners if that becomes desirable in the future. Next slide. So a little historical context. The majority of these mineral interests were severed from the surface estate and owned by partners in Rocky Mountain Fuels and their successors since the late 1800s, as important holdings to their coal mining operations in the Marshall and Superior areas. The city's interest in these holdings is not new, as Dan detailed, and open space staff have been evaluating and pursuing portions of these interests since actually at least the early 1970s, including the attempted negotiation that Dan mentioned with a previous owner in 2015. Next slide. You may be wondering if this area is important or at risk for mineral development. Summaries of the geology of the area show it lies at the eastern edge of the Colorado mineral belt, where much of the state's gold, zinc, and copper are found, and the western edge of the Denver Basin, which is a geological formation that forms a very productive petroleum province, including one of the largest natural gas deposits in the United States. The geology also obviously includes coal-bearing formations. Next slide. This geologic nexus is evidenced by the historic gold, coal, clay, sand and gravel mining activity in the area, as well as expanding oil and gas development lying just west of these holdings, and drilling proposals, recent drilling proposals in the Rocky Flats area. Next slide. The regulation of mineral development depends on the type and location. For example, hard rock mining, like coal mining, is overseen by the Federal Office of Surface Mining, State Division of Reclamation, Mining, and Safety, and somewhat by local land use regulations, while oil and gas development is regulated mostly by Colorado's Energy and Carbon Management Division, which was previously called COGCC and is now ECMC, as well as city and county land use regulations. And those land use regulations can vary dramatically and also sometimes conflict even with state regulations, which is not ideal when directional drilling technology allows for oil and gas development up to 5 miles and crossing county and jurisdictional boundaries. Next slide. Additionally, while existing state and Boulder County regulations related to oil and gas are fairly robust, They would not entirely prevent development and extraction proposals to utilize the surface of the city's open space lands or from adjacent properties that could still implicate or affect these properties through air, noise, or other impacts, or possibly force the city to expend significant time and resources to try to prevent such development. And an even stronger likelihood, shown by evaluation of the potential of these holdings, reveals that at least one concept where oil and gas reservoirs under city-owned open space could be exploited by directionally drilling from a site in Jefferson County, where the regulations are not as robust. Similar to a recent proposal along the Boulder and Weld County line that you see in the left side of the screen, and at a scale similar to that seen at the nearby Livingston pad in Broomfield, which is evidenced by the pictures on the right side, in the middle and on the right side of the screen. Next slide, Nate. So whether or not the threat of mineral development is imminent, staff believes this proposed acquisition represents a practical and strategic step that will better control our future and strengthen our stewardship of these open space and adjacent properties with less reliance on shifting regulatory winds and is consistent with open space purposes. Again, this is not a new priority for OSMP, but we do now have a willing seller who has been approached by other entities offering far greater sums than being proposed here. And to be clear, these funds are available in the acquisition reserve of the department's carryover and would not impact OSMP projects or programs. Next slide. So I put the staff recommendation. I don't need to read it because it will be in the motion language, but I have put it on the screen. And staff does support this acquisition. Next slide. So now that you know all about the geology of this area, are there questions?
Any members of the any trustee have a question? Brady?
Yeah. I understand that the seller proposed two different versions of a swap that would have reduced our cash outlay. One was around $800,000 and one was zero. Could you talk a little bit about your analysis of those offers from the seller? I mean, I know it's not in the packet, but it seems material to the decision.
Yeah, when originally approached by this, the seller does live adjacent to open space lands and was proposing an exchange where he would acquire open space property in exchange for these mineral rights. The precedent setting there and the concept that it is very difficult and there was no interest by open space to be disposing of property, the property adjacent to his, because it was it very much fulfilled open space purposes that we negotiated through that proposed option.
Dan, do you have anything to add to that? Is it the precedent? I mean, I think there was going to be a conservation easement potentially.
No, the lands that were in question was a large, significant parcel that we've been seeking to purchase for many, many years, and that was completed in 2017 or 2018. We're going to be going through a robust planning process for the future of that land and in the coming years, and just felt like it's a very high agricultural land right now. And it's fulfilling charter purposes, and it's not on our radar to dispose of that property. In fact, we worked really, really hard to finally negotiate a successful purchase for that several years ago. So yeah, just starting off with that exchange, we first analyzed the importance of the lands that we would be giving up, and it was something that was that would be staff's recommendation not to pursue that.
Okay, thank you for that.
Okay, anything else, Brady? Michelle, do you have anything?
No questions right now.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm glad you addressed the issue of the surface ownership, all these different entities, including Boulder County, Parks and Open Space ownership. And I get that, you know, they're kind of like, great, you're buying it. So why would we contribute? But there is value to having a unified title. And I think your notion that, you know, this could be a valuable a bargaining chip of some kind to play in the future, you know, it might sound crass, but it's not. And we're putting up a lot of money for this. And if there's some kind of sharing you know, that we can, it's sharing of responsibility, policing, whatever, you know, that the county can offer someday in the future in return for us giving them the mineral title to lands where they own the surface. You know, keeping that on the radar is a great idea, and I support this. Um, I support this recommendation of staff that we go ahead and buy this. I think we can finish question and answer. Do we have any deliberation around our decision here tonight?
No, I think you made a good point there. I agree with what you said.
And I also want to say, I thought your question was great, Brady, and I agree with what staff decided to do, because I think, this is also, and staff didn't say it, but in my mind, it's a bird in the hand worth two in the bush kind of thing, where we never know whether minerals are going to get developed, but we know for sure that there are open space values in the land that the seller wanted to bargain for, and we don't want to give that bird in the hand up for some, speculative value down the road. So I'm very much supportive of this application.
I'm very supportive of it as well.
Yeah. So being that this is a public hearing item, I keep jumping too quickly to deliberation. We do accept public comment. And so if you have any comment on this public hearing item, please make yourself known or sign in for speaking.
We continue to have a few complexities with public comment. We had one person sign up in advance, Carol Maybach, who it does not look like is online anymore. Carol, if you're one of the phone numbers that's showing up and you're calling in by phone now, you can raise your hand or press *9. We've also been having a chat with Lynn Siegel, who indicated she'd like to speak, but I believe she has also dropped off again. So we can do the same thing and give folks a few seconds to raise their hand or press *9. In the meantime, if there's anybody online or in person who did not sign up but wishes to speak, we can call them up.
Yeah, and while we're giving those folks a chance to dial in or to raise their hand online, this public comment is specific to this acquisition of mineral estate matter that we have in front of us. So that is the only public comment we'll accept at this point on this matter.
And neither of those folks is online at this time, and there are no additional hands raised online, and nobody else in person has signed
Okay.
up.
Well, then let me close. Let me close public comment. I was closing myself at the same time, and just ask if there's any more comment or deliberation from the board.
Yeah, just just a question, Bethany, around the price that we're paying. I think you mentioned that, there are other bids out there for considerably more than the 475 per mineral acre. Is there a way to tell, like, do you have comps from recent purchases to see, just to kind of add some color for us of like how this price compares?
I don't have recent valuations. However, recent being in the last couple of years, I can tell you that mineral rights in kind of the Longmont over the Wattenberg formation, so closer to Weld County, actually in Weld County, because Boulder County has been difficult to develop in. Letters were going out that were somewhere in the area of $3,000 per acre at a minimum. So if that helps.
Okay, yeah, that is helpful. I don't even know what these things cost. So I'm generally in support of this. I just had a big gulp when I saw the $2.7 million price tag and the fiscal constraints that we have that we're being faced with here. But I'm in support of it.
Okay. If there are no other items for deliberation or questions, I'll entertain a motion. Yeah, make the motion if you're going to do it.
I moved.
That the open space.
Thank you. I move that the Open Space Board of Trustees recommend the acquisition of approximately 5,840 net mineral acres of mineral interests from Teton LLC, located under properties owned by the City of Boulder, Boulder County, and other parties in Southern Boulder County for open space purposes. I think there's is it supposed to say mineral? Oh, net mineral acres of mineral interests. Okay, great.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay, is there a second? Okay, so we have a motion by Glenn, a second by Robinson. And we'll take a vote by roll call. Robinson?
Yes.
Glenn?
Yes.
Estrella?
Yes.
And I vote yes, so 4-0. We vote to approve. Congratulations, Bethany and staff. Well done. And Dan, I'll give it back to you for the next item on the agenda.
While Mark comes up here, I was going to grab my water, but it'll be fast. So Mark Pedrucci is going to come up and present on this item, which is the disposal of approximately, and I don't, he'll reiterate it, but it is the consideration to recommend and approve the disposal of approximately 250 square feet of the Lewisburg open space to resolve an encroachment and boundary issue. And he will get more into it in just a moment.
Thank you for that. And
Yep, got it.
thank you. Good. Okay. Thank you very much. Good evening, trustees. My name is Mark Pedrucci. I am the senior property agent for Open Space and Mountain Parks. And I'm going to present our Lewisburg open space disposal this evening. Next slide, please. I'll go ahead and read the agenda item. This is the request to approve and recommend that City Council approve the sale of approximately 250 square feet of the City of Boulder's Lewisburg open space property to John and Kate Barbaras pursuant to the disposal procedures of Article 12, Sections 175 and 177 of the Boulder City Charter and conditioned on approval of the boundary adjustment by Boulder County Community Planning and Permitting. Next slide, please. Okay, this slide on the left is the vicinity map. Shows the general location of the Lewisburg open space, which is located south of Boulder Reservoir and near J Road and 51st Street. The location map on the right shows a portion of the Lewisburg open space and the property at 4475 51st Street, owned by John and Kate Barbaras. The triangular area that's shown in red is the area of encroachment and that we are proposing for disposal. Next slide, please. I'll kind of now explain the background and history of this encroachment. This slide shows the land survey plat that was done in January 1996, just prior to the acquisition of the Lewisburg property by the city in May of 1996. And please do note on this survey, north is to the left, not the top, so it does appear a little bit different than the rest of the images in this presentation. The enlarged area in blue, in the blue box, shows the property boundary, which is a thick line, and the existing fence, which is a thin line with X's. Now, I will admit that's very small. And so the next slide shows this in greater detail. Thank you very much. So again, the very thick dark line is the property boundary. The really thin line with the X's, that shows where the fence was located when we purchased the property back in May of 96. Those blue arrows show where the fence was relocated. So shortly after Open Space purchased the property, we relocated the fence in one location, but not another location. So where the blue arrows show, the fence was moved. And if you notice, you can see a tiny little triangle. That's the area where the fence was not moved. Next slide, please. And so this slide, it shows the land survey plat that was completed last year in 2024. We did this in advance of installing new fencing on the property. The enlarged area shows where the fence was relocated, and it was placed directly on the property boundary. Survey also shows that the fence for the triangular area is still in the same location as it was in 1996. And this is really what led to the encroachment. After the city moved the fence in this area, the Barbarases, which they have owned that property prior to 1996, so they remember when the city acquired the property, moved the fence. After the city moved the fence, they made the assumption that the fence must be in the right location, must be on the property boundary because they made an adjustment, but it was only adjusted in one location, not this other small triangle. And that's kind of what led to the encroachment. They proceeded to place underground irrigation infrastructure in that small triangular area. Because the city did not relocate the fence to the property boundary in all locations, we feel the city has some level of responsibility for this situation. The Barbarises have requested the ability to purchase this area from the city versus the alternative of excavating and removing the irrigation infrastructure. Given the circumstances and the relatively small size of the encroachment, staff feel it is appropriate to allow for a disposal. Next slide, please. And so this just shows this slide, a summary of the draft purchase and sale agreement. We have not executed this yet, but we're proposing to execute with the Barbarises. The purchase price for the property will be $1.35 a square foot, and the total will be based on the surveyed size. We haven't finished the survey and the legal description for that. It's about 250 square feet, that triangle. Total cost for that area would be about, we estimate around $350. All the due diligence costs will be paid by the purchaser. And of course, the purchase and sale agreement is contingent on approval by the Open Space Board of Trustees as well as City Council. And then also contingent on approval of a subdivision exemption for a boundary line adjustment with Boulder County Planning, Community Planning and Permitting. Next slide. This last slide just has, it's a photo of this encroachment area. The orange marker that you see, the lath with the orange, that's the actual property corner. And so where that kind of worn path is, that's this area of encroachment, this small triangle. And with that, thank you for considering this proposal. And if you have any questions, I will certainly try to answer them.
Questions from the board? No. Michelle?
No.
Okay. Just one. Is it easier for us in case we're doing any wooey mowing to not have to go into that, very tight little triangle? Does it actually make life better for our operations?
Yes, it kind of does. That little triangle, I mean, it's because it comes to a point, it's really not
hard to maintain.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is hard to maintain. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
We'll take public comment now on this matter.
We have one person signed up in advance to speak. That's Kate Barbaris. If there's anybody online, you can raise your hand or press *9.
Okay. Good evening.
Good evening.
I'd like to, first of all, thank Mark Pedrucci for working with us, coming to the site, evaluating the problem, and proposing together a solution. And I thank you for considering it. Mark gave you some very good background, so I don't feel like I need to add to that. He explained why it happened. But one thing that he didn't really address is how much infrastructure is in that tiny little portion of land. And we did submit to him, a list. And so it's if you would to say, no, we won't do that, the job to adjust that is very, very big. So I beg you to consider that when you're mulling this over. And I appreciate that Mark has proposed a reasonable solution, and I hope it can make it all the way through the process, and we won't have to deal with the consequences of not solving it this way. So thank you for your consideration.
Thank you. Any other people signed up for public comment?
There's nobody else signed up online or in person.
Okay. Just checking one thing. Just want to see it. I'm just looking at whether this is in a subdivided. Do you know if it's a subdivided lot in a subdivision or whether it's a legal meets and bounds legal description on this?
Our property is meets and bounds legal description. The Barbaris is in a platted subdivision, yes.
Okay. Yeah, that's what I was thinking. So it may be that the county process is going to be an exemption plat and not a subdivision exemption.
I believe because the land being given up is being added into the subdivision. Mark has done a pre-app with them, and so
They said it was a subdivision
they
exemption.
said it was a subdivision exemption.
Yeah, they did. I did a pre-application conference with their planning department, and
Okay.
They said subdivision exemption, lot line adjustment. Yeah.
Okay. Any deliberation among the board? No? Okay. I'll entertain a motion.
I move that the Open Space Board of Trustees approve and recommend that City Council approve the sale of approximately 250 square feet of the Lewisburg open space property to John and Kate Barberos to resolve a boundary and encroachment issue pursuant to the disposal procedures of Article 12, Sections 175, 177 of the City of Boulder Charter and conditioned on the approval of the boundary adjustment by Boulder County Community Planning and Permitting.
Okay, I'll take it. Is there a second?
I second.
All right, so we've got a motion by Robinson, seconded by Glenn. Take a roll call vote. Robinson?
Yes.
Glenn?
Yes.
Estrella online?
Yes.
Okay, and I will vote yes. So the motion passes 4-0. And congratulations, Mark, and the rest of staff. Nice work.
Great. Thank you. With that, Chair, we are ready to move into matters from the department. And we're going to get started with a wildfire resilience item. So I'll wait for that staff to come in. We actually have some guests from other departments here as well. So a chance for us to introduce a couple of chiefs to you that are in the house. Brian Anneker probably will cover it a little bit, but as you all know, we completed a CWPP update last spring. But that is quite a big plan with a lot of action called for. In addition to that, we have almost 20 additional plans within the city that the city has adopted that also has wildfire actions that are called for. So one of the challenges is how do we take the CWPP, all these other plans, and merge it under one umbrella? And that's the concept of what we're calling the Wildfire Resilience Implementation Plan. So it's not necessarily to create a whole bunch of new action, although things are being identified as new and we can put it under here, but to put everything under one umbrella so then we can prioritize it, we can sequence it out, we can cost it, and that's what we're doing. And it's a citywide effort. In fact, as you know, we brought George Greenwood on board to help with the first phase of this program. He's being funded through a citywide fund, although he's sort of setting up in the open space building. But Brian Anneker is overseeing this effort, and he's going to be leading the presentation.
Thank you, Dan, and good evening, trustees. Brian Anneker, OSMP Senior Manager for Science and Climate Resilience. As Dan mentioned, I've got 3 guests joining us tonight. OSMP's Wildfire Senior Program Manager, Paul Dennison. Hi, Paul. We also have Chief David Lowry and Chief Brian Oliver. Welcome. And as we move through our presentation, I'll have them come up and deliver their slides from the podium here because we don't have quite enough chairs. Here's a bit of an outline of what we're going to cover tonight. I'll start by reminding you about the Wildfire Resilience Implementation Plan, also known as RIP, and then daylight a new concept called action areas, a way to describe the work underneath that plan. And then to give some examples of some of these action areas, we'll have an update on homeowner grants and detailed home assessments from Chief Lowry. Paul will give you an update on prescribed fire. And then Chief Lowry, Oliver will talk about wildfire response capacity. Sorry, Brian. Of course, we'll wrap up with next steps and prompt you for any questions you might have. Before we jump in, I just want to acknowledge a huge number of people that have been involved in supporting the development of the Wildfire Resilience Implementation Plan that we're presenting on tonight. We all come together in the form of a wildfire resilience team. This photograph was taken a Friday morning in May when we got together for a multi-hour, not a retreat meeting. And all in, we're looking at staff from 10 different city departments. I've put those department acronyms on the people and then spelled out those department names in full in the bubble below. So huge amount of collaboration going on through this wildfire resilience team. And then I want to give a specific shout out to George Greenwood that Dan alluded to. He's had a major contribution in building the foundations of the RIP plan. I also want to recognize a few people not shown here. Alicia Alexander from OSMP, and then 2 staff from City Manager's Office, Liz Petoni and Jen Thompson, really been instrumental in helping us get organized and building a portfolio management system that we're leaning on to put all this stuff together on the back end. So I mentioned the wildfire resilience team, just to say a couple more words about that. At the highest level, we have the executive team component of the wildfire resilience team. That includes directors and chiefs from all of the aforementioned departments, as well as the assistant city manager, Pam Davis. And their job, as we've outlined it, is to set high-level priorities for implementation on the heels of the CWPP. And then the core team includes staff from all of those constituent departments with the job of implementing the vision set by the executive team. Because there are a lot of people involved in the core team, as we went through last year in developing and chartering ourselves, we saw a need to form some smaller units, and we're calling these committees, organized along the national cohesive strategies. The 3 strategies are fire adapted communities, resilient landscapes, wildfire response. I kind of like to think of those as it all starts at an individual's home and building out mitigation efforts to reduce risk. Next layer out in the onion is dealing with the resilient landscapes to reduce risk at that private public boundary. And then when, despite our best efforts, we have an ignition and a wildfire begins, then we take on safe and effective wildfire response to put it out and protect values at risk as quickly and efficiently as possible. And then undergirding those 3 topical committees, we have a communications committee and a budget committee led by Jamie Barker from communications and myself for the budget work. In terms of overall governance, I mentioned we have a team charter and we update that annually. That describes how these teams form, who's on those teams and what their goals are going to be. We've got a degree of team overlap, and you can see those circles showing that as a Venn diagram. So we've got people who sit on multiple different levels of these teams, so the information flow can happen seamlessly. We develop an annual work plan, and one of the things we're working on right now is the development of the RIP, for example. We have a lot of meetings, of course. Executive team meets monthly. Every month, one of these committees is meeting, and every 3rd month, the full core team is getting together, so forth and so on. So constant contact across 10 departments. We put all the resources together that you could ever want into one stop shop on SharePoint. So even if you don't think about wildfire resilience every day, you know where to go to get relevant information. And we even developed a decision-making model to describe how these entities make decisions and what do we do when we can't get a shared decision in terms of elevating and escalating that to a different level. Just a quick reminder where we've been with the Open Space Board over the last couple of years. We just saw you in May for the Open Space Field Trip. We're here in June as our 12th touch, and then we'll see you again in July. As Dan mentioned, we're going to have a focus on wildfire prevention and a summer sprint of effort that we're working on in that area. Thinking back to a couple weeks ago, we had a resilient landscapes focused field trip with the Open Space Board. And we heard from Chris Warner and Kelly Ewing on prescribed grazing and the forestry program around Shanahan area. We heard from Paul Dennison about our perimeter mowing program. We talked a little bit about the RIP program and how we're going to approach progress evaluation and conversations with the community. So thank you for joining us there. I think we all agreed that was a really successful field trip. So what are we talking about going back to 2024 when we published the update to the CWPP? In fact, we have the project manager here in house and Brian Oliver. Thank you, Brian, for delivering this for us. And if you have any questions about anything on any page of this plan, he'd be happy to answer them. So the foundation I've already mentioned, the cohesive strategies, fire adapted communities, resilient landscapes, and safe and effective wildfire response. The CWPP did more than that. It gave us 38 different recommendations and 52 different projects. So narrowly defined, our job to implement this plan is to take a look at those items but we knew there was a lot more in the ether, as Dan alluded to. Right at the same time we were doing our CWPP, the Boulder County was approaching an update to their CWPP. We have several updates to various climate plans that talk about wildfire. All in, we got a list together of about 25 different city plans. And the first job that we handed to George Greenwood was to read all these plans and extract out of them every idea that's ever been mentioned around wildfire resilience, out of which came 100+ additional recommendations and projects. Because we were gluttons and we wanted more information, we continued to do staff engagement. Here at that last wildfire resilience team meeting, we said, write down on a sticky all the accomplishments and projects that you have in progress since the last time we got together, and put them up on these easels, one per cohesive strategy. We took those projects, typed them out, checked them against our standing portfolio, and added dozens of more ideas into the system. So to put that into a cartoon as a funnel, we've got the CWPP as a big input. We have 25 other city plans that we scanned and extracted content from, and we did additional staff engagement, out of which came a portfolio of about 166 projects. On the way to that, our list grew to around 300 or so, but through consolidation and removing duplicates, we put some in a parking lot that were either ill-defined or we just needed some more research on them. We ended up with 166. 54 of those are works in progress where we're actively talking about them. 75 are up and running, and then 37 have been completed in the last several years. So that's a lot of bits of information, 166 ideas. One level of framing for that is, of course, the 3 national cohesive strategies, but we felt like we were missing a step in between those 2 scales, a step in which it would allow the executive team to think about wildfire resilience as a whole, and also allow us to talk to the community in a way that goes beyond fire adapted communities, resilient landscapes, and response. So we developed, working with staff, the concept of action areas, and we're calling them RIP action areas, where we bundle those projects into about 18 different action areas. And I'm going to step through those to give you a flavor for what they are. And then our guests will illustrate a few of those for you. So taking that same frame and moving it to the left, cohesive strategies at the top. I've mentioned those multiple times here. So to fill in under fire adapted communities, we have 5 action areas: community risk reduction, homeowner grants. Chief Lowry will be talking about those momentarily. Building codes, we just went through a big project with City Council, working with Chief Lowry and staff from planning and design and other parts of the city. Research, what are we learning from the Marshall Fire? Where are gaps in understanding how fire moves from the wildland into the urban environment and then propagates through built environment? Other research needs. And then recovery, post-fire, how do we get the community building back better, and how do we take care of our landscapes? Same treatment for resilient landscapes. We landed with these 5: mechanical fuels, which was the big emphasis from the May field trip. Prescribed fire, Paul will give you an update there shortly. Cross boundary, how do we work with our neighbors who are working on both sides of the fence in a coordinated fashion? What do we do with all the biomass that we're taking out of forests and grasslands? And likewise, how do we facilitate residents from getting their debris out of their high risk zones and off of their properties? And then finally, in Chief Oliver's world, it's wildfire response capacity. He'll update you there. We've talked about ignition prevention, I think 5 or 6 times tonight, and we'll give you a deep dive on that in July. Focusing on evacuation and dispatch. How do we form our incident management teams and get departmental support for that? And then water. How are we doing on water for fire suppression, and what does it look like to keep safe, treated, potable water in the event of a fire and after a fire? So now the cool thing that once we have the world of wildfire resilience described in these, I forgot 3 more. Undergirding this, a lot like our committees, is the concept of responsible governance. So everything above is the what. The bottom foundational stuff is the how. So how do we tell our story to the community through messaging? How do we engage with our community when we need to go beyond and inform and have more of a listening and a brainstorm and a collaboration? And then partnerships. We know we're not going to go about this alone as the city of Boulder. We have a lot of regional partnerships, whether it's Boulder County or the neighboring fire districts, and some of the researchers as well. Okay, now that we have that framework, some of the cool things we can do with it is think about spotlights or priorities. What is it time for in terms of additional investment? Where's the conversation in the community? And another way to say that same thing is, where are our priorities? So I just dropped 2 priority items for each of the areas to make a short list of 8. And that starts to become direction from our executive team. We want to see what all you're doing in these 8 areas and what more we can be doing to move the needle on these. Executive team might also say, hey, we want to add a 6th action area into this list, or maybe it's time to remove one of these action areas from the list. So having this framework allows us to talk about prioritization and ultimately what's in the backbone itself. The other cool thing is we can take that project portfolio and start to layer that on top of these action areas to look at where staff's time and energy is being focused. And so in parentheses here, I've just dropped the number of active or draft projects across each of these action areas. So for example, just looking at the top line, we have 9 active projects on community risk reduction, 30 in mechanical fuel reduction, 14 on wildfire response capacity, and 18 on messaging. So it starts to show you where your relative investment of time and energy goes, and you can make adjustments once you start to see the level of investment. And there's other ways ultimately we'll be able to report out on this beyond number of projects, like dollars invested, staff time invested. And moreover, the interactive portfolio on the back end, any one of our staff can open one of these action areas and actually look at the 9 projects and then open that project and look who's the project manager, what's the scope, schedule, budget, status. And we can talk about the health of that project. We can roll those up to the action area. We can roll them up to the cohesive strategy, and we can roll them up to wildfire resilience writ large. So a lot of flexibility there, a lot of different ways to cross-tabulate, but a nice coherent way to bundle the information and start representing the work in a more complete, but not hopefully exhausting way. Okay, with that, we're going to transition and ask Chief Lowry to join us at the podium, if you would, please. And I believe
Been here before. Yeah, well, thank you. We appreciate you taking the time and listening to this. And I think it's quite amazing work that Brian Anaker, sorry, and his staff have been doing on this. I'm going to talk just about a couple of those projects, not all of them, obviously. Please let me know if you have questions. First is that community risk reduction. We have what we refer to as a detailed home assessment program. In that particular program, just DHA is what we call it. On that one, it is performed by my staff, Boulder Fire Rescue staff, within the community risk reduction. These are trained staff as well that are not we don't send someone out to look at that. They actually go through quite a bit of training. And this is also all recorded on a piece of software called Fireside. That we purchased a little over a year ago, almost coming on 2 years now, come this fall. And that is a specific piece of software that is designed to do these detailed home assessments. So we all have it recorded. Every time we do one, the homeowner gets a report directly to them that they are able to download. It actually comes very secure to that particular homeowner. And then I need to kind of, to do this, anyone in the city can request a detailed home assessment, and we will do a detailed home assessment for anyone within the city. We obviously concentrate or would like to concentrate within the area that we've designated as Wildland Urban Interface, the WUI, but we will do one for anyone within the city. And then what I do want to emphasize is that that report that we give that homeowner are recommendations. In other words, we are not performing enforcement of any recommendation or any item on that particular checklist. And I do think that's important to understand. I'm not at all indicating that that's going to change. Not, please don't read into that. I think it's just important to know that we do a DHA, we give the recommendations, we kind of give it in a format of good, better, and best type situation of what people can do to harden their home and their property against wildfire, and that's how that kind of falls out. The information in the brown type box right there, it's a little dated, but not horribly dated. By about a month, I guess. Since November of 2023, we've completed 600, a little over that now, but just rounding is fine for what we're talking about. We have, I can't really tell you if that number is that accurate. It may have picked up a little bit. Scheduled for May and June, we've got about 60 on the books. Said that may be a little more, maybe a little less. It's interesting, we go through waves, I would tell you, right? When the LA fires occurred in January, we were hit with approximately 200 requests going in January, February, in March of that particular area. The other program that we want to talk about is the Wildfire Resiliency Assistance Program, known as WRAP. Right? We got a RIP and we got a WRAP in this particular area. So I do want to emphasize this is managed through the City of Boulder Finance Department. It is not a Boulder Fire Rescue, right? This is completely a finance department that we obviously support. OSMP supports it as well as other departments. It was opened in September of 2024 and then closed towards the end of November of 2024. That was our pilot type program in that particular one. In that time, again, we're going to round here, but approximately $50,000 was given out as assistance for home improvement and home hardening during that period, and the applications is kind of ongoing. We're going to open that up in June of 2025. You look at me, that we're in June of 2025, right? I mean, like tomorrow technically is the date, right? Is when it's supposed to open back up. In order to do this, you do have to have a detailed home assessment and to qualify for that. It is only eligible for people within the designated wildland urban interface area, and that does include the expanded WUI that we just got through council. A couple of changes of that particular program. Households are eligible for $2,000. In our pilot program, that was a $1,000, but we have increased that to $2,000. That doesn't have to be a one shot. Like, you don't have to like add up to $2,000 at one time. You can apply multiple times to that $2,000. And then something we're going to try this year, we've opened it up to HOAs are now eligible, and that HOA could be eligible up to a $10,000 grant as well for their property. Good. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And Paul, would you please join us?
Good evening, trustees. Good to see you again. Paul Dennison, the Wildland Fire Senior Program Manager with Open Space and Mountain Parks, here to talk about the prescribed fire action area, which has been emphasized by our executive team and many other city staff and community members. And I hope those of you on the Board of Trustees as an area to accelerate and invest in for risk reduction primarily. This first slide shows one of our coworkers on an agricultural ditch burn. I'm going to hope that you all have enough of an understanding of prescribed fire as a land management tool and just move into our efforts to accelerate the utilization of this tool. Next slide, please. So with direction from Dan Burke, Fire Chief Mike Calderazzo to develop scenarios and ideas to accelerate the city's prescribed fire program. I've been collaborating very much with Chief Brian Oliver, who you'll hear from momentarily, and many on our staff and his staff in the Boulder Fire Rescue Wildland Division on ways to increase our use of prescribed fire. And in the context of the wildfire resilience efforts that Brian Aneker gave an overview of, prescribed fire fits within the resilient landscapes strategy, but when it comes to its implementation, we very much rely on the expertise and implementation power of Boulder Fire Rescue's Wildland Division, particularly their high-level qualifications that are needed to safely implement these prescribed burns. So it's a very collaborative effort, very time-consuming, and one that requires quite a bit of expertise and experience and very thoughtful and thorough planning efforts. So I'll be mentioning him quite a bit, and you all will have a chance to ask him any questions that I can't answer. But I credit Chief Oliver with having what I think was a very good idea and now a course of action that we're committed to, where we were getting a little stuck in some of our conversations about what we need for staff prioritization and investments of our time and approaches to develop the prescribed fire as a program. Brian Oliver recommended that we choose one of our moderate complexity burn plans, one that does accomplish risk reduction or public safety objectives, and we commit to attempting to implement one of these complex burns that we haven't seen on the landscape in several years due to a variety of reasons. So by setting ourselves that goal and that challenge, we're going to determine where the capacity gaps are and just what it takes to reintroduce prescribed fire on the landscape, particularly with a public safety objective. And what you see on the screen now is a map of the Flatirons Vista burn plan. It's an approximately 1,800 acre burn plan on open space and mountain parks land, generally to the south of the Eldorado Springs Drive communities. And it's broken up into 8 units. And Brian Oliver and I agree that our goal will be to implement at least one of these units. The first one you see in lightly shaded blue is between 300 and 400 acres. And if we are successful in mobilizing the right resources and we get the right weather conditions for implementation, we'll go for more, but we want to set a realistic and hopefully accomplishable expectation for 2025, fall of this year, when fuel dryness and weather conditions are in alignment with what that plan specifies for safe and effective accomplishment of goals. So I don't mean to diminish the ecological and agricultural outcomes and goals that are associated with this project, but a lot of the interest in accelerating prescribed fire does relate to its role in risk reduction. So that's what I plan to focus on, and any questions you have in discussion there's time for will be focused on hazardous fuels management and the protection of communities and residential values at risk. So we are now in pre-planning processes. Brian Oliver, his staff, and our staff are working together to ensure that notifications to agricultural tenants are made early so that grazing plans can be modified to exclude cattle from potential areas that will be seeing prescribed fire, and to start to develop operational plans that account for ecologically sensitive areas within these burn units. As I mentioned, prescribed fire does require a significant staff demand, and Chief Oliver, in addition to being the chief of the Wildland Fire Division, is currently our only qualified burn boss to implement prescribed fire of this complexity. So I mention that because the kind of people who we need to rely on to implement such challenging projects are often in fairly senior leadership positions, because the experience that gets you to this level of qualification also usually leads you to successful and illustrious careers. Just trying to make Chief Oliver blush. So in addition to the pre-implementation planning, having good operational plans, and having that be well coordinated with a variety of agricultural and ecological staff at Open Space, we're in the early stages of developing a good community engagement and messaging strategy with a focus on residents that will be in closest proximity to the burn area. Next slide, please, Brian. And I'll conclude with a map that I believe Brian Aneker, or perhaps it was George Greenwood, has shared with you in the past, so it may look familiar. This is a work in progress as part of our efforts to develop visual displays of our wildfire resilience efforts. This shows hazardous fuels management treatments and other disturbances that reduce wildfire risk. And I wanted to show this because prescribed fire can be used effectively as a standalone treatment to enhance public safety and reduce risk, but it's also recommended as an enhancement or a complementary management technique to be used in addition to forest thinning, for example, or in cycles with grassland management techniques such as strategic grazing or mowing. So in seeing maps that show wildfire risk reduction, fuels management treatments, Brian Oliver and I share a long-term goal where most of these treatments are shown on the map, and particularly in wildland-urban interface areas or open spaces, natural areas adjacent to communities. We would like to see plans and projects for prescribed fire to be introduced in many of those areas. It's very ambitious, but we intend to learn quite a lot from this 2025 goal of implementing a portion of the Flatirons Vista burn plan. Thanks. Good to see you all again.
Thank you, Paul. Chief Brian Oliver, we've all been waiting. Here he comes. Thank you, Brian.
Hey, we got your name right this time.
Got my name right this time. Good evening, trustees. Thanks for having me. Yeah, here to talk about some response capacity and some of the enhancements we've made in the last couple of years and even before that. And hopefully I meet expectations. Paul set me up for failure here. So current staffing, Boulder Fire, we have 130 uniformed personnel. A minimum of those 130 are on 25 are on duty at all times, right? 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And all of our firefighters are trained to a basic federal level NWCG wildland firefighter. So we do have trained wildland firefighters on duty 24/7 at all of our fire stations. 7 stations. We do have our dedicated wildland facility, which is my shop. And within that, I have 6 wildfire operations specialists. And those folks are, for lack of a better term, are force multipliers. They're very highly qualified, very experienced wildland firefighters at the task force level and division supervisor level. So basically, if you want to equate it to military, they're field generals. They're the ones that can take a group of firefighters at basic skill levels and put them in a safe and organized, effective manner and get a lot of work done. And so that's kind of our general objective. We began requiring the wildfire red card or incident qualification card in 2005. So all of our firefighters from 2005 on have been trained and certified. We do have some older folks that still have the training but might not meet the full qualification, but they do have all the information. Next slide, please. So within that, all those folks out there fighting wildland fire, we do have, of course, several pieces of equipment that we rely on for our everyday response, which is 5 Type 1 engines. Those are the big, we call them pavement queens, big red fire trucks you see rolling up and down the streets with their lights on. 3 ladder trucks, big engines with big ladders. Not all that helpful in a wildland fire incident, the ladder trucks, but the personnel that are on them are quite helpful. And then within that, 3 urban interface pumpers, which are smaller versions, but they're higher ground clearance, shorter wheelbase, so they can get into more remote areas, backcountry, move up some of our drivable trails in the system, and things like that. So within that 3, there's a 4th one we just ordered. It's due in September. We'll be actually going up to do a final inspection on that here at the end of July. We also have 3 Type 6 engines, which, for lack of better terms, is a pickup with a water tank and a pump on it. They're smaller units, which again can go farther into that backcountry, into some more of those remote areas, lighter, easier to maneuver, especially in an urban interface environment where we're chasing spot fires and things like that. And of course, one of those is actually owned by OSMP, and we're currently, one of our improvements is working on a LOA to actually move that from OSMP, put it in our response system with the 7-day staff, 24/7 firefighters, and get that moved. So it's increasing our response capacity at our Fire Station 7, which is the eastern edge of the city, to start picking up some of the the Eastern Land System and Southern Land System. Next slide, please, Brian. And then, of course, how it works, one of our big improvements since the Marshall Fire is we moved to what we call indices-based dispatching. It used to be all the different jurisdictions in the county, which there, I believe 18 different jurisdictions have some sort of city-owned and managed lands in their response areas, used to create their own standards of cover and respond however they saw fit. What we've upgraded now is countywide, we've created an indice-based, so as fire danger increases, we increase that response capacity. So what would be, you know, a type 1 engine, a type 6 engine, and maybe the shift commander. On a high day, that turns into 4 airborne interface pumpers, 4 engines, 2 shift commanders, so on and so forth. So that's one of our biggest pieces that we've made adjustments to. The other really cool thing that's happening is closest unit dispatching. Right now, we currently have 2 separate but equal dispatch centers. Though the county dispatches fire agencies outside the city has their own fire agency dispatch center. And that creates some chaos and some confusion as far as who's responding to what. The standard is, you know, they take the call, figure out whose jurisdiction it is, and then send that responsible authority. With closest unit, we're taking all of those boundaries away, and the closest unit is going to get dispatched to the fire regardless of jurisdiction, and that's going to really increase our capacity and our effectiveness on that one. Another really good piece that we use is upstaffing. Same kind of concept as indices based. As we reach up into higher fire danger days, red flag days, high wind warnings, we bring in additional staff. Currently, those type 3 and type 6 engines are what we call cross-staffed. And so the 4 firefighters that are at the station respond on both. They can either take the wildland apparatus or the structural apparatus based on the call type. But when we go to our high indices based, we bring in overtime so that we can move the wildland apparatus to a wildland call and not impede regular everyday 911 calls, and vice versa. Those wildland rigs can move in through the system and help augment all of those other call types. We also have the IMT. So once we start reaching our capacity as a jurisdiction, we have a regional incident management team that's comprised of, well, everybody on my staff is on it, and then all of our surrounding neighbors and our county fire management shop, we all collaborate and move to have a regional type 3 incident management team, which is the next step below calling in the federal system when we start getting those, you know, very large fires, Marshall, for example. The state has augmented their system, and we now have what's called the Colorado Mutual Aid System. Same kind of concept as upstaffing and indice-based. There's a need-based system statewide now, where it's really one phone call. Once we've exhausted our mutual aid system, so the city and our surrounding neighbors, we can reach out to our counterparts at the state. They start mobilizing all of our state resources and other fire departments outside our jurisdiction to kind of surge onto an incident. And then, of course, agreements, right? We have open space and utilities and so much city-owned property across the county. We can't respond to it all, so we have several agreements that are reviewed every year or so to ensure that those different agencies are responding and providing the coverage level and the response that we require to our city open space system. That's a bit of what's happening on the capacity side. Any questions?
All right, thank you, Brian. I'll just have one slide on next
Brian,
steps.
Do
and then
you,
we'll
you
take
want us to
questions.
just hold all our questions? till
Yeah,
then?
it'd be
Okay.
20 seconds, if you could. So like I mentioned, we'll see you again in July. We're going to give you more details on wildfire prevention initiative. For the RIP program, we're thinking about fall as our quote unquote go live for staff to start thinking about 26 through 2030 work planning in more detail, another round of prioritization, and thinking through budgets. And then as of Q1 2026, we will hopefully we're planning to roll out a progress evaluation for the community. Taking feedback we heard from you in May about multimodal, different tactics, different channels, being creative, but at the minimum committing to do an old-fashioned story map, which will include metrics and maps and photos and videos and text. So that'd be the minimum viable product, but we will do our best to make that more engaging for more audiences. I put a few prompts here. Feel free to read them and respond to them, but in general, I'd love to just open it up for questions. And Harmon, it sounded like you wanted to kick us off.
I'll let other trustees start if anyone has a question, wants to kick us off. Sarah? You might have a few.
I might have a few.
Okay.
I'm really happy that we have for the group that we have in the room right now. Thank you all for your presentations. They were really informative, and I'm really grateful for the work that you're doing. It is an enormous task that we all have here before us. So one of the, is it okay if I do questions and comments, or would you like for me to really stick with questions?
Yeah, let's just stick with questions.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I was
So
saying let's just stick with
I want to make
questions.
sure. Yeah, okay. I wanted to ask about, so these questions that you have, well, should I be answering these questions or asking my own clarifying questions? I want to make sure I'm
the
sticking with
question, the
process.
Q&A slide is Brian's help. You know,
Okay.
Brian might have thought we wouldn't have any questions, and he gave us some
Okay,
prompts. But
great.
if you have your own questions, by all means ask them. And then I think I'd like to
Okay.
just see that if you have questions that might drive some of your comments and discussion,
Sure.
great. And let's do that after the questions are over.
Okay, great. You know, I love to follow the process, and that's not always easy for me, so I have to ask. Okay, so I see that we have fuels reduction, prescribed fire, cross-boundary cross-boundary projects, biomass utilization, ignition prevention, incident management on the plan here. And I believe that those are squarely ours here in open space. Is that correct? When I'm trying to look through and understand a little bit better which of these things belong to us here at OSMP versus which things really belong to the fire department or utilities or the finance department. And this is going to be relevant when we get into our budget conversations later. So it's I'm double dipping a little bit on these questions. I believe that the community engagement and then the wildfire response capacity and suppression sits somewhere in the middle. Those are really, truly interdepartmental efforts. And then I believe that the things that are just not us, but that are really important are the community risk reduction, so the DHA assessments and the RAP grants. Am I about on target there? Is that I want to hear from you guys how you're seeing this, because your first question is what are the gaps?
Yeah,
And I feel like we almost just have way too much going on here.
Oh.
I'm going to use the analogy of drinking from the fire hose. So I'd love to help me kind of piecemeal these out for what is ours.
Well, I'll have
here.
Brian join me in a response, but I would say there are a few of the 166, for instance, there's a few that are squarely in either an individual's hands or a work group's hand or a department's hands. And then there's going to be a lot that are crossing, in which, for instance, prescribed fire, we just heard, that's going to be on open space lands. We certainly have a part, but we couldn't implement it. We need Boulder Fire Rescue to come over and actually lead it. We need Brian's certification to actually put the fire on the ground as a qualified burn boss. So while you could look at resilient landscape as prescribed fire, oh boy, OSMP, do you have the capacity to do that? We have the land base, and we certainly have Paul's expertise and some of our staff that could help assess what ecological stuff, but that's a big lift for Boulder Fire Rescue, for instance. And then there's sort of the opposite end of that, which is incident management team. That's a very small part of OSMP. There's oftentimes that we're on that team, but this also has a whole projects underneath that. For instance, we have our own department operations center. If a fire happens in open space, how do we mobilize as a department to assist the effort that's being led at first by Boulder Fire Rescue? So again, you wouldn't think that that's ours, but we have a small part to play in that. So I think the answer is there are some that are clearly forest thinning, prescribed grazing, the mowing project, 95% that's OSMP. And I could say the same thing about some of the stuff over in other utilities, the water, that's primarily utilities department is looking at water capacity, what's going to take to keep our water clean and when there is a fire. So yeah, unfortunately, it's not as clear as maybe, or I would say fortunately, it's not as clear because it's all hands on deck. And as far as do we have the capacity, the reason for this plan is to set up a annual work plan over the next 5 years, which does meet our capacities as departments, that does meet the budgets that we have. So we wouldn't develop an annual work plan that we're unable to fulfill. Otherwise, that doesn't do anybody's good. So I don't know if you have anything else, but.
I think that was really well said. I think the real value add in this team, this framework, is that we are all privy to each other's work, and we do have a little bit of leadership or responsibility built into the committee structure, such that Lowry's in charge of fire adapted communities in the sense of calling that meeting, getting everybody talking, seeing if there's missed opportunities, needs for more alignment. Paul's doing the same for resilient landscapes and Oliver, but all three of those guys are kind of in each other's committee meetings, so there's no secrets and it's really transparent and working together because it's highly integrated. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So it really is. So it's either on our land or it's coordination with, it's either on OSMP land directly or it's coordination with other departments for things that involve our teams and our land. Really, the home assessments, are we directly involved in any way? Aside from being aware of it, are we directly involved in the home assessments in any way? Or are we directly involved in RAP, our budgets, our team, aside from being involved in the citywide resilience meetings and retreats?
Laura, you might want to add to this. I would say our involvement would be as if they're out there. No, we're not involved in actual carrying out any of the detailed home assessments. Where we could get involved if they're working somebody directly on the WUI interface and they have a question about the vegetation on our side, and then they look on their property and they look over the fence and say, well, what's open space doing on their side? We could get some calls from your team saying, hey, there's questions about what's happening on the other side of the fence. And therefore, we would get involved, but not from their property perspective, but on management of open space. So I also just want to, by no means are all these things happening on open space. And in fact, a lot of these things are happening within the built environment, within city limits. For instance, evacuation planning, safe evacuations, that's, police department, fire department, Office of Disaster Management. Open space doesn't really have much of a role in that, although if our trails could be used or if our roads and open space could be used, we certainly want to make that information available to those that are developing evacuation plans. But that's another example of something that's not in our bailiwick, but we're certainly here with information if they need it.
To the other members of the board, I find today, I was out walking on Wonderland Lake and I was encountering members of the community and I was really excited because there are cattle grazing out there and I'm really excited about that program. It's fantastic. But my daughter's here with me, we were stopped, we were talking to people. When you open up this conversation about what's happening with fire resilience in the community, and then if I share that I'm on the Open Space Board of Trustees, the questions just start coming in. And we see that here somewhat in the public comment as well. So I'm not trying to overcomplicate, I'm trying to simplify a little bit in my own mind where am I best suited to talk about things, where are we actually managing things, and then where is it appropriate to say, hey, here's your contact. It would be really helpful for me personally, and I don't know, I won't speak for you, but as a trustee and as a spokesperson, which is one of my primary roles, to really continue to understand this. And then of course we have budgeting conversations, which are totally separate. I think that was my primary, I'll stop there because that's taken up enough time. Yeah.
Great. Brady, you have any? Michelle, questions?
Sorry, I do, but it took me a while to get to the unmute button.
Yeah, you're good.
Hey, thank you for this great presentation. I think the fact that you all came in here as a team and presented on your different sort of areas was helpful to kind of illustrate how the city's departments are working together on this effort. And also, thanks for explaining the structure of the team as well. I have a question for Paul Dennison. Hey, Paul, you talked about prescribed burns at Flatirons Vista and like the communications plan, I think, community engagement and response, and how you're generally trying to be, you're, because I know you have to pull permits and you have to do a whole like statewide notification um, process in order to even be able to plan for this. And it sounds like you're aiming for the fall of 2025. I know you're being opportunistic, so you're looking for like the right conditions to be able to do a prescribed burn, and you're looking at the forecast and air quality and all of that. How much notice do you have to give to surrounding communities? And I'm thinking primarily about those who might have asthma, or I know in the South Boulder area, there are a lot of facilities for our seniors. What is that engagement or notification window? Because I know it's all time sensitive. You're looking for that right window, but like how long do you have to give members like, hey, this is time to go somewhere else because we might have a prescribed burn?
Great question, Michelle. Chief Oliver's looming over my shoulder, and he's better suited to answer the question.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Yeah, to answer that, so our minimum requirements for our state issued smoke permit is 24 hours. But we typically start that outreach process 7 to 10 days prior to any planned ignitions. We start trending the weather, start looking for those windows of opportunity, and start reaching out to the community with leaflets, flyers, press releases, all of those things saying that this is potentially on the horizon. We do manage a full list of people that have registered as smoke sensitive receptors, so people that have extra issues with smoke. We reach out to those people personally through email to make sure that they are aware we're attempting to implement a prescribed fire. And then, of course, we try to give 72 and 48-hour notice, but again, the minimum is 24, and that, in my experience, is not enough time. So we try to do that, but again, we're at the whim of Mother Nature, and sometimes those windows come upon us very quickly, and we have to act.
Thanks. And are there resources for people who might need, say, oxygen support, extra oxygen support during that time? And like, what other agencies or departments are you working with to make sure that I don't know, like, are you working with Boulder Community Hospital, for example, to deploy resources like that?
That's a very good question. We've not had anyone reach out and ask for any kind of extra support like that. We have asked, folks have asked if we're going to pay for their hotel out of town, and that answer is usually no. But I've not had anyone reach out and say, I need extra oxygen or I need any kind of other supplements. They usually take the notification, make their own plans, and take care of themselves. But we certainly can reach out to the Office of Disaster Management and their community preparedness folks and see about coming up with some sort of reasonable accommodation for that as well. We can definitely add that to our plans.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. Can you put up the prescribed burn slide again, Brian?
Yep.
Thanks. And, Paul, for the record, I consider you to be successful and illustrious enough to answer these questions, but if Chief Oliver wants to jump in, that's fine too. On this slide, you said, Paul, that there was a burn area that's going to be the first one. And you said it was light blue, but there may be 3 of these blues that could be considered light blue. It's that one. So is that designed to be the one that's the furthest away from houses?
That wasn't the main reason. You can sort of tell with the satellite imagery, but a lot of these units are predominantly grass. Some are predominantly ponderosa. And we wanted to start with a predominantly grassland burn because it's slightly lower complexity. The distance from the valleys at risk also factored in. The fact that units 1 and 2, so thank you, Brian, for zooming in on the map. They're bounded by roads and trails to provide more ready control features for operations. So they're relatively simpler units to implement. But as I mentioned, if we get the right implementation window and we have the right resource mobilization we intend to be prepared to move forward with additional unit level implementation.
Okay, and that's getting towards the other questions I had. So the way to kind of do these units one at a time is that you've got fire breaks that are either man-made or natural fire breaks, so you can try to keep it within a unit and see how that goes, move on to the next unit. And then you talked about grassland. Is the idea that if these grassland fires that are prescribed are very successful, that we might move into more forested country?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that's the goal.
Okay, and then the other question doesn't have to do with this map, and I'll be done. Is just based on sort of the density of fire stations and personnel, does it seem like this closest unit system will result in more of a burden on BFD than the other? You know, is our fire department going to end up overburdened? Do we have cost sharing or any way that we can get back, you know, the money that it costs to do more response if we're doing mutual response and we end up doing most of it?
The theory is yes, but the understanding across the jurisdictions and across the different fire chiefs and agencies is that it is a give and take relationship, and some fire departments will take on a larger share. Us, and specifically Mountain View Fire Rescue, will probably move into other jurisdictions more often than not because we have those resources.
Right.
And I think it's just agreed upon that that's part of the deal, is because if we're helping them keep their fires small, they don't become our problems, and vice versa. So it's just more of a give and take.
Okay, thank you for that. Anything else, trustees? Okay, thanks for that wonderful presentation, and it really is amazing to me to see that when this department breaks things down into stuff that looks like plans with, you know, interlocking circles and stuff like that, it's actually not just to make pretty pictures. It results in action, and I applaud you for that very much.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thank you, Brian's, and thank you, Dave, for being here tonight, and Paul. Really appreciate it. All right, we're going to change things up. Lauren's especially going to change things up. She's going to go from helping to run the meeting to actually participate as a presenter. But we are coming into, I guess, sort of the home stretch on our 2026 budget work with the board. And Cole Moffitt and Lauren have been taking up the lion's share of that work. As you all know, Sam McQueen also does a lot of this work, and she's out on maternity leave. So these two are shouldering even more of the work than typical. And so I think Lauren is going to be leading the presentation. Cole will be supporting it. But just in that, just want to make note that behind the scenes, Cole's been a heavy lifter here and working on the budget front. So with that, I'll turn things over to Lauren.
You bought me the perfect amount of time. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, everybody. Lauren Kilcoyne, one of the deputy directors here, and Cole is off the hook for presenting, but as I'm acting for Sam, he knows all the specific numbers and all of that. So when it comes to Q&A, there may be times where I need to lean on him. So we're going to make this pretty straightforward. I think the packet had a lot of information that I didn't want to repeat. And then we've been going back and forth on email with some additional questions that board members have had. So normally what we would do this month is talk in depth. We'd have a new board member that would have been sworn in. We'd have to explain the whole structure of the budget, the definition of terms. We have the benefit of having a returning board member, so we don't have to do any of that.
Finally useful.
Fantastic. And so we're going to keep this very streamlined and just talk through what's the update on the budget development process since last we spoke, talk about the questions that you all have had and how we address those, and then provide time for you to ask any additional questions to make sure you're ready to come back in July with the recommendation. We are cruising through our very long cadence here and continuing to follow the updates that we made after talking with y'all on the retreat. So doing a couple as written, starting earlier in the year, kind of adjusting the flow. So we're here in June. Your last time talking about this year will be next month for your recommendation. I do just want to comment that most of your packet focuses on operating and CIP information. There is a brief touch on revenues in the packet, but that was a focus of a previous, back in April, Sam provided the actual budget revenues and the adjustment to base and all of that. So I didn't spend a lot of time on that for tonight. There's also a category of our budget called reserves, which is not really referenced other than if you're looking at our fund financial. So I'll just mention very briefly, since I got here, since the flood, we have been using 20% estimate, so 20% of operating and debt as our contingency reserve amount. We are going to be decreasing that to 16.7. That is the recommended minimum across the city. It's also what the general fund keeps in reserves. So this allows us to access our emergency funds. We still have 16.7% in reserves, but it frees up some extra money that we could appropriate into the budget to be able to address some of the increasing costs of doing business and just wanting to program that in actual work on the ground. We've already talked about the other reserve on our books, which is the acquisition reserve that came up earlier tonight around mineral rights. So I'm not going to repeat all of that. Our budget, this is just a different way to display what's on the fund financial. We try to have our budget reflect our org structure. And so you can see the division breakdown here, the service area breakdown. And our goal is always that we're maximizing money to projects and programs on the land and for the public. So we want most of our budget investment to be in community connections, resource stewardship, and visitor experience and infrastructure. We've talked about this a lot over the course of this budget process, but we continue to be in a fiscally constrained environment. So with the expectation of slowing revenues and increased costs, we're focused on our highest priorities. That means master plan tier 1 strategies, the strategic enhancements that we've talked about in the budget. So wildland fire and climate, asset management, presence on the land, and then making sure that we're continuing to align to the city strategic plan. Our goal here in a constrained environment is that where we can, we like to accelerate in those areas, but really we're trying to maintain the enhancements that we made in 24 and 25 and operationalize those. So that shows up across our budget. We just talked about it in the previous presentation. We want to continue our climate funding with an emphasis on wildland fire resilience and then continue to prioritize system maintenance and presence out on the system. So what has happened since we last spoke with you? Finance presented revenue forecast to City Council on May 8th. Our meeting was after that, but the packet came out before that. And so none of that information had been captured in last month's packet. It was a great presentation. It's available for folks to listen or watch, but it more or less aligned with what we'd been saying anyway, fiscally constrained, a lot of economic uncertainty. We don't know about tariffs. We don't know about increasing costs, and just really signaling that we should be conservative in our budget over the next year. From here, so we had the revenue update, which allowed us to gut check our materials. We put together a draft fund financial, which is the 6-year picture that was in your packet. And now we start submitting things. So we submit to the finance department and the city manager's office on 6/27. So if there's feedback tonight, we take that back, we get it incorporated before we submit. And then there are these parallel tracks that start. So the executive budget team, which is city manager's office and some directors, will be reviewing at the same time that you all make your recommendation. And then it proceeds to planning board for the CIP and then city council later in the fall. So a lot of that is status quo. That's how it goes every year, but this is where we are in the process right now. A new piece of information that we just received on Monday is that the city has announced a hiring pause through the end of the year. So I believe last month, this was actually a question from the board. How are you planning on managing that? What's the personnel expect? So we put a bunch in the packet about our approach to long-term staffing, but this is more immediate, right? So for the next 6 months, there would be a hiring pause on vacant positions. Fortunately, open spaces hiring is more or less done for the year. This would have had a major impact on seasonal and temporary field crews, which is where we get a lot of our maintenance done in the year, is through those crews. So all of that had already started. Our last seasonal and temp orientation was May 12th. So those folks were all on board, but we have a couple of vacancies. We have very limited vacancies in the department. And just now we just heard about this on Monday. So we're just now starting to assess how much savings is that going to generate? And then what are the service delivery impacts of not replacing those vacancies for the next 6 months? So it's a work in progress, but we continue to enact our longer term plan around FTE reductions and fixed term staffing, and all of that is stuff we've put in the packet and talked about previously. So finally, I'll talk through some of these look backs, and I don't want to be repetitive, so I'll probably go pretty quickly here, but we've been talking about trend data, what's been going on over the last 10 years, how are we setting ourselves up for the future? We know we have a sales tax increment changing again in 2034, and just a lot that's changed in the fund that we need to manage. So in the packet, we did 10-year look backs at the CIP, staffing FTE level, so not seasonals and temps, but our FTE, and then cost allocation. Since the packet went out, we've had continued conversation and questions around cost allocation, the Enterprise Technology Fund, and then the overall impact of cost increases on the Open Space Fund and on our operations. In the out years, so you have an attached fund financial that shows our 6-year horizon, and you can see in the numbers how we're planning on having these gradual reductions across all of our expense categories to get back to a place where we're managing within annual revenues. We've been using fund balance that we saved specifically for master plan implementation to float these couple of years where you see that our expenses are greater than our revenues for the next couple of years. But by 2029, all of that is returning into within annual revenues. And that's through a combination of reductions across personnel, non-personnel, capital budgets, et cetera. The packet does call out some specific actions in 27 and 28 around fixed term staffing and some positions that we know that will be expiring that are vacant. And that's that. So for CIP history, I won't spend a lot of time on any of these 10-year lookbacks, but we see the fluctuation. The first couple of bars here during flood recovery. So the flood was in 2013, but then it was a lot of FEMA work, immediate needs, and then the major capital construction projects weren't until like 2017, 2018, 2016 too, which is out of the horizon. And then we dropped down. And those low years are COVID response and recovery when we were making budget reductions. And there were a lot of concerns about deploying crews out on the land and the safety of that. We then start to return to what I would consider our normal pre-flood average CIP over the last few years, hovering around 6 million. But in the out years, as you look at the next 6 years, we do show gradually decreasing our CIP as part of our overall budget reduction strategy. With FTEs, most of our changes over the last 10 years have been seasonal or temporary employee position conversions to standard, which could be standard ongoing or fixed term. That doesn't change our overall department staffing level or head count, but it does change employee classification and benefits and winter work and things like that. So a lot of that relates to Equal Pay for Equal Work Act, Affordable Care Act, and then HR's interpretation, the city's interpretation of those laws and how they relate to the employee classifications that we have in the organization. Where we have added positions, they've been related to Tier 1 master plan priorities. So examples here would be wildland fire, prairie dog management, which was a strategic enhancement in the first few years of the master plan implementation, and then the trail maintenance backlog. And again, just to reiterate, we know that staffing personnel is the biggest expense in our budget, and there's no way to manage the current climate without looking at that part of our budget, right? But we're trying to do that in a way that honors tenure and service and people's retirement plans and attrition, and do this in a gradual way that makes sense for the fund and for the organization. This is just a summary chart which shows that over the 10 years, we increased our FTE by 15.7. Again, most of that was converting seasonals or temps to standard. But when a FTE position is expired, we're not then doing the reverse, right? We then don't add a temp position or add funding. So we've actually net reduced our staffing by about 2 FTE during that horizon. My final slide is on cost allocation history, and you can see that for most of the 10 years, well, more than half of the 10 years, we were looking at slow growth. There were a couple of years during COVID where they paused increases and kept things level. And then really it's since 2023 that we're seeing an uptick in the rate of growth. And that relates to all the things I wrote in the packet around increased cost of doing business, cost of inputs, what it takes to deliver services. So again, the 6-year fund financial has the projection for what the next 6 years will bring, but this was the 10-year look back for reference. So with that, I will stop. I have a couple questions up here. One is, do you have any questions regarding the overall budget? Make sure that we can answer those or come back with information. And then thinking about July and coming together to make a recommendation, is there anything you feel like you need from us to be prepared to do that next month? That's that.
Thank you. All right. Well, I think those questions that you put up at the end are important because, next month we will make a recommendation on the budget. So, you know, we don't want to be asking staff to make major changes to budget numbers in the July meeting. I think that puts it kind of towards the end. So, you know, let's get to those questions tonight and then do some follow-up if we have to. I'll open it up for questions right now. Brady?
I've got a really quick one to start and then a little longer one. You said that FTE analysis, Lauren, that didn't include temp or seasonals.
Correct.
So when you include the temp and seasonals, how has our staffing changed actually when you're not just the full-time salary, but the everybody in the mix?
Yeah, I would say seasonal and temp staffing since the flood has remained largely consistent. We added a lot of, during flood recovery, a lot of trail crews and ecological crews. Since then, it's been more or less stable. We estimate every year around 225. I looked at the last few, we've had 3 financial systems in the 10 years, so piecing that together was a bit of a moving target, so I didn't get to share that. I looked at the last couple of years. 2 years ago, 225 down to 223 last year and 221 in the current year, but it is more or less stable.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for doing that look
Yeah, of
back. I
course.
appreciate that. And I just have to say, you pinged us for questions on Monday and you got back with a really extensive answers to my questions. And just you've been really helpful, proactive, and transparent. And I can't thank you enough. So really well done. I appreciate it. So I've got a few comments to the board mostly. Is this when should I do that?
Yeah, why don't we get our questions out, get all the information we need, and then we can
Okay.
sort of.
Okay. Then I don't have any other
deliberations
questions. I got comments and deliberations later.
Perfect. Okay. Michelle, did you have anything? What, you ready to go?
Yeah,
All right.
sorry. Yes, Lauren, yeah, I wanted to echo what Brady said, that you have really responded really extensively to his questions. And I was reading through those today and I thought, yeah, those were great questions and great answers. I especially like the trends that you had and kind of you made a comment in there in the email about the exit of the library department, which I think we haven't talked about really explicitly, but I see that cost allocation increased quite a lot during 2023 when they officially exited. And I guess my question there is, does the new library, so I understand cost allocation, absolutely. I'm a finance person myself. These things just don't pay for itself. But does the new library districts, does it use any of our current resources? And if so, do we charge back any of them? For any of them?
It's a good question, and I'll probably take it to Charlotte and follow up with some more specific answers. I believe at the time that they were exiting, that was something being negotiated, like continued use of that building and who was going to own it, and was it a buyout or an ongoing charge? I don't remember the specifics of that, so I'm going to take that as some homework. But in terms of the impact on cost allocation, the exit of that department, so most of the plan is allocated based on FTE or percent of overall city budget. So at the exit of that percent of city budget, those charges got redistributed to all of the other funds, right? So internal service departments, for example, didn't reduce their force because they were no longer supporting the library. So those charges just got reallocated to other groups. But the specific chargeback models that are in place right now, I'll get back to you on that.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just curious because we see a big jump between 22 and 23 of $671,000. And I'm just wondering if a lot of that is because of the library district.
Yeah, the library district would be showing up more in the last 2 years. I believe, Lauren, correct me if I'm wrong, during COVID 2020, 2021, especially moving into 2022, they actually paused, for the most part, increases to cost allocation. I believe in 1 year, it might have even dipped. And so they didn't re-up or redo their analysis during the COVID years. So there was sort of a pause in increases for about 2 or 3 years. And then when they back and reassessed it all, they they essentially had to make up for those because there were, and then there was an uptick in staffing. Everybody went back and up their force back to pre-COVID levels. So therefore, the cost allocation would need to account for higher staffing that started in 2023.
So there's a lot of noise in there in these trends. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, at that time, the time frame Dan's talking about, we were talking about major supply chain issues. We couldn't get things to staff to be able to. So there were a lot of compounding factors during that era. Absolutely.
And then also in this email you have, and I know it shows up in other places, but the percent cost allocation to the OSMP budget relative to OSMP budget. I was curious what that is relative to like other departments in the city. So, and how it compares. I mean, I did a Google search to see like what percentage of OSMP's operating budget is to the overall city budget. Who knows if this is right, but it says the internet says 8.2%. And if I look at the, I don't know if that's right or wrong, but if it's directionally correct and we compare that to the cost allocation of OSMP, that sort of checks out to me. And yeah, and I see a nod. Does that sort of check out
Yeah,
too? Is that how you would look at it as
those
well?
numbers are more or less accurate. And it's actually that comparison you just described is something that when Dave and Karen, some other folks were here, they would ask for that every year. So we understand what percent cost allocation is of our annual budget, but what is it relative to the whole city budget? And that's something we would provide. And at one point there was, because of our arrangements with the general fund, there were different subsidies that were engaged there. Those are gone. And so it's kind of a straight calculation. So I'd have to look if that's comparing to current year 2025 budget or whatever, but I think that is more or less accurate, that would be our share of the overall city budget. The first part of your question about what percent are other funds getting charged relative to their budget. We don't know. The published budget document has a cost allocation line for every fund, of which there are dozens. So we haven't done that research or that work to assess that. What they did provide us last year was a summary of percent increase. So I think it was a 65% increase to the open space fund. And then it was broken down by every fund. So we're in a position where we have one fund supporting most of our work. Parks and Rec has 5 or 6, transportation has 3, utilities has several. So, but that we do have that broken down of, did we all take a similar increase? And I think for the enterprise funds, transportation, utilities, and us, that looked pretty similar across those departments.
Okay. And then I guess the other question I have, and this is going to be like so hard to measure, but like looking at the trend or the last 10 years, how has our work load or work plans changed over time? I sort of feel like we're a pretty demanding community. And people who care about open space really care about open space, so they may be even more demanding than some of the OSMP department compared to other departments. Could you sort of like describe how the work maybe has changed over the last 10 years? I mean, I know the things that I've seen that, I mean, when you've done like the master plan, that's a huge effort. You've done a lot of engagement with, the tribes. That's a huge effort and also a remarkable one. And so, yeah, is there a way to kind of describe that over the last 10 years? My impression is like we've not asked you to do less.
No, and we care very much about serving the public. We also have a staff that is unbelievably passionate about what they do. And so when emergent or unplanned things come up, they're not quick to say, okay, what comes off the plate, right? They're like, okay, let's double down and do that and my regular workload. So part of our focus on work planning over the last, I don't know, 8 years or so has been around resourcing our time. So we actually go through the exercise of having project managers and staff allocate how much time they think. We have about 350 projects a year. And I would say that's been consistent basically every year that I've been here. So we have them actually allocate estimates of time. And when they're significantly over the budget for their position of hours, then we have a work plan steering team, which is our director's team, that says, okay, what projects are going to come off the plate just to try to keep things a little bit more reasonable. Where we're starting to make improvements is around citywide work planning. So up until now, each department has a work plan, but you don't share those. So when there's the long-term financial strategy or our partnership on CU South or South Boulder Creek Flood or, some of these big citywide initiatives, we haven't been able to factor that into our planning because we don't have a central system where we're sharing that. So the city's been working on that over the last year so that we can do better planning. But I think as we talk about increasing costs and potential service delivery impacts and decreasing FTE over the next several years, that's something where we'll have to come together and be really strategic around what we can continue to do and if there's going to be any impacts on the ground. I don't know, Dan, if you have additional
Yeah, I would
comment.
say Lauren and I joined just around 10 years ago, around the same time. And I would say the biggest difference between our first 5 years and these last 5 years, going to how has work planning changed? 2016, we went through the North TSA plan, a huge initiative, over $10 million, maybe upwards of maybe of $20 million worth of implementation. Then in 2017, a year later, we developed the Agricultural Resources Management Plan. And then 2019, we did the Open Space Master Plan. And then in 2020, we did the Prairie Dog Preferred Alternative. So I think the difference is we have intentionally wanted to pull back on large scale planning and move into implementation. So I would describe these 2020s as implementing the vision that we've been putting forward, as opposed to engaging in large scale planning efforts and putting a lot of resources into large scale comprehensive planning and needing to get to implementing all the plans that we have developed and are still in the works. So I think that's overall, that's one of the shifts that we've intentionally also set, is our plans tend to be a little bit more specific, area plans or site plans, and to allow us the time to do implementation of a lot of the work that we have visioned previously. But, we need to give ourselves capacity to do that work. Wildfire is probably an exception. That's something that is emerging, that we're doing a lot of planning for while we're trying to keep up the implementation pace.
Yeah, I mean, that computes with my experience. I mean, I feel like 5 years on a board is a really long piece of one's life, but you do get to see, the life cycle of the department, like a really big chunk over 5 years. And I saw how much effort CU South, just getting that approved took, and all of the extra meetings, all of the extra public input. And I mean, there were a ton, and now we're getting into implementation phase. And so that's almost more gratifying, like you're actually doing the work that you've been talking about over the last several years. But I see like how your human resources get directed toward these really big plans, and then you shift them to implementation, and that almost feels, I don't know, at least less charged. Maybe less meetings, but more work. So yeah, that's helpful. That's all I had.
Okay, thanks, Michelle. Do you want to jump in, Sarah?
Yeah, sure. I have a question not related to wildfire. I know. I'm trying to toggle through various sheets here, so forgive me. It's exhibit or attachment A. We have the beginning fund balance in 2024 actuals. We start there at 29 million, and then 2031 projected, we're just basically draining the fund down to 8 million, is what I think I'm seeing there on the very top line. And then I also see that we have the reserves with the contingency and acquisition and vacation bonus sick reserve. Can you help me understand what is this fund balance? And I have I think it may be simple, like, is this okay that we're taking it all the way down to 8 million? Can you help me understand that decision?
That's a great question. Thank you for asking it. It's always a really interesting balance, right? Because these are sales and use taxes predominantly that we're collecting from the public, and we want to show that we are investing the tax dollars and doing the work that the voters asked us to do in the open space charter and the organization of our department. So I mentioned earlier that for years we were sort of saving fund balance to put to use for master plan implementation, and that's like that's the other edge of the sword, which is it looks like we're hoarding taxpayer dollars and not putting it to use, and the public expects to see us out there doing projects and getting maintenance done. So it's always a line that we walk where we want to show that we have intention to program the tax money that we're collecting, and we're trying to put it to use to accomplish all of our work. So we check in with finance on this every year. What is the ideal bottom right corner amount? Like I ask that every year. And under our previous CFO, she would say somewhere between 1 and 2 million feels right. So in past years, when you've seen this from us, you've seen that where now it says 546,000. You've seen that around $1 million to say we think we've planned for a lot. You know, we have a sense of our operating. We have solid reserves. There's enough money to hold us. We can pay our debts, but we still want to keep about $1 million extra. What you're seeing here is really that we're now responding to increasing costs and a changing revenue picture, and we still feel confident that with a 16.7% contingency reserve, so that's $5.5 million that we're not appropriating into expenses, that we could weather that storm, that we could handle that and reduce that bottom right corner from, you know, about $1 million to what you're seeing here, about 500,000. So we also know that this changes, it's a 6-year planning horizon, but the budget is approved every year. So as we know more, we can react, right? If things got tight, we would be looking at, I don't know, making budget reductions in 2029. That would make sure that by 2031 we'd be okay. But in general, the intention is that we're programming all of the sales tax dollars and then just leaving enough for emergencies that we'd be able to cover.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I want to echo what's already been said, but truly your response and follow-up has been epic. It's been really good. I didn't write to you until like 2 o'clock this afternoon, and I wasn't even expecting any response. Thank you for getting back to me on the questions. So then the next question that I have is for, in the operating funds, we have resource stewardship as a general line item going across. And I'm actually quite proficient. I can understand when I'm looking at this kind of a spreadsheet, but then there are several tables that are sort of embedded, not just in this board packet, but in previous board packets. And even if I had more time, I did spend a couple of hours, but even if I'd had more time, I'm just going a little bit cross-eyed, trying to really understand these full-time allocations. I'm seeing, as you know, I have questions about, do we have enough money for fire resilience in this? Truly, do we? And I'm seeing full-time equivalents under climate and science. I'm seeing, then last month we had the full budget. I'm seeing 2.5 million total staff allocations. I'm seeing 3 100% staff allocations in the May packet compared to, I think 4 total just in the 4.0 allocation on this table. I think it's on page 7. I forget which page it was on. I think it's on page 7. I want to say up here. Yeah. I'm sorry, page 8. And is there somewhere that this information would be that I could more easily grasp it without asking you to create even more tables, or because I really want to understand this and how it fits with the org chart that I see printed online, where our staff are and how we're allocating these full-time positions, especially in the fire resilience camp. I mean, we talked about WHIP, WHIP. We talked about that, and Brian will be working on the budget in a few months after we've already approved this budget. And I'm just not clear how much wiggle room we have or how to intelligently engage there. So I'm trying to just back it up to the simple questions now.
I'll take the one that's not related to the budget, Lauren, take the rest.
Great.
The budget subcommittee under the core team is only for the climate tax fund allocations. So the $6 million voter approved tax was passed. And out of that 6 million, 1.5 million is to be earmarked annually for wildfire resilience efforts across the city. So the question is how do we make recommendations around that 1.5 as a city. So there's a core team on the, there's a subcommittee on the core team called the Budget Subcommittee, and they're the ones that are trying to suss out where in that 1.5 million of the climate fund dollars do we spend annually, not related to our budget. So.
When we received in the packet last month,
Yeah.
the allocations for fire specifically,
Yeah.
I think it was about 2.5 million. I could shuffle through here and go pull up the
Yeah, it
exact
was,
number.
3 points, almost
Total
3.8.
for, yes, for the total fire, but then staffing allocations of that were about 2.5. And so that's about a third of our total resource management line item on that, on the actual budget. And then I think I heard earlier a comment that our wildfire resilience program manager, who's on our org chart, and I believe is shown in the packet last month as being one of our expenses, is an allocation, is one of our full-time staff and allocated here. Do you see where
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
my question is, I just don't see how it all fits together completely so that I can even ask better questions.
What you're saying makes sense, and is a gap in our reporting structure. So I mentioned our fund financial follows our org structure. So if you were to ask me how many people do we have in trails, I have that on the org chart. Forestry, I have that on the org chart. E&O, I have that on the org chart. For some of these major initiatives, our practice is really to pull together cross-functional teams. So that's true for climate and wildland fire. It's true for equity. It's true for these planning projects where we're pulling expertise from multiple work groups or multiple divisions in order to be able to accomplish that. So you are correct that it is difficult, if not impossible, to look at what I provided you in the packet, which is accurate, right? Here are all the positions working on fire. Unless you really knew their job titles, you wouldn't know, is that in VEI or RNS or community connections? And so unfortunately, it really is like, hey, can you spin us up a table for that? On the chart of accounts, like in our actual accounting system, we have object and organizational codes that allow, so flood recovery is one that will probably be around in my whole life, where every work group was doing flood recovery. So there's a specific code that everybody charges to show this is an investment in flood. I just happen to sit within trails. So we can run reports off of that, but those aren't the types of things that are available in public documents or in the budget book. It's a level of detail that is really in the weeds on accounting. So, but if you ask us those things, we can also be adding, columns to this to say this position lives in visitor infrastructure, community connection, if that's useful to you. But I would say for these department-wide initiatives, we're pulling people from across the organization to go to work on those. So that's distributed across the whole budget.
Great. And then the question that I'd asked in the email, I'll just state out loud here, is if you didn't have to worry about a budget constraint environment, and if you could read the crystal ball and look a year from now, once we have that WIP plan mapped out, because I think you've been sitting with this I know you've been sitting with it for a couple of years, and I believe you probably have some good idea of like, what would the perfect scenario be? I'm curious. I always like to know what that is, and then to reverse engineer, how can we get there? When can we get there? So that we don't feel like we're running out ahead of something that we're not resourced enough for it. We have BOSC with potentially a lot more fundraising capacity, and it's already within the charter of what we're going to do through fundraising at BOSC, for example. And what other creative ways could we work on ensuring that we have the budget that we truly need to work on fire resilience in the way that we're talking about doing here in these meetings? I think it's crucial. So whatever level of reporting at this stage feels relevant, or more table making. I don't want to create more work than is necessary, but whatever would be useful and relevant and possible to do in this time, I would be grateful for.
Okay.
Also looking at that, well, what's missing? Like, what maybe don't we have? What do we need to consider so that we can that's how we're going to solve for it, is by knowing what we need to solve for.
Yeah, thank you. I see Dan taking notes, and we'll follow up on it. I would say I have one comment, and then the rest is maybe for homework. In order to, we've known that this is like the thing we're accelerating. It's the one area that we've been growing our budget. We've been forming a new work group, adding CIP, et cetera, with good reason, of course. And so we've funded that through increases to our overall appropriation over the last couple of years, but also through reallocations, right? So as we're scaling back in other places, we're diverting funds into those efforts. And so that's I guess my sort of like high level, that's how we've gotten to the current state. I think a lot of what you're asking though is like, what is the vision? What's the dream? What would we need in an ideal scenario? And so you can comment on that, or we can come back to it.
Yeah, well, I actually, over the last 3 years, we will come back with more information, but where we were 3 years ago to where we're at today, I think we have set ourselves up to be able to implement what we want to implement this year and next year and the year after. We didn't have Paul Dennison's position. George is being funded. We're housing him. We'll get reimbursed through the climate fund for George's time. So not funded through open space, but yet sits here. So we didn't have George. We didn't have the water technician concentrated on wildfire. We had 8 forestry staff. Now we have 13. So we did do some large scale investments in 23, 24, and 25 with, was George was 24 still, in order to set us up for this sprint that we're going to go on, that RIP's going to tell us to go on for. Where we could adjust more easily is in our temp and seasonal workforce. We provided, this year was the first year where we provided Paul a seasonal, 9-month seasonal has been, to work every day on helping Paul on the ground implement stuff. Now, next year we have a proposal to do the same. So if we feel like in the RIP world that we need to accelerate and we're under an FTE constraint, there is some shuffling we can do, especially within our temp force, to get on the ground people. We also do it through contracting. So Paul has contracting money to contract out ready to work crews. They're the ones out there doing the mowing. It's not Paul. And we contract out with our local agricultural tenants. It's not Paul who brought the cows in. It's Andy Breitert who we pay and contract out for that rancher to come in to do that work. So there's a lot of ways beyond FTE where this work gets done. But I think we can put some data together for you to help fill out that picture a little bit.
Great. It will be so much easier for me to get excited about approving this budget if I feel really confident that we have a plan built in, leaving ourselves allowance for fire resilience so that we're not having to cut other departments or do other things that we would be really unhappy to have to do. And then the last thing, it is a comment. I just, on page 6, you mentioned converting vacant education and outreach positions to bilingual roles. And I understand that we're on a bit of a pause right now, but I just think that's really exciting. I love seeing that. Thank you guys for everything.
And they're all filled. So those
Oh,
folks are
great.
on board and delivering Spanish speaking programs.
Que bueno.
Thanks, Sarah. So Brady, you had a follow-up?
Yeah, just a quick follow-up. Lauren, I want to understand how you think about fund balances. So I'm going to say this and you tell me if I get it right. So you've got an algorithm that calculates the OSMP contingency reserve, acquisition reserve, and the sick vacation bonus reserve, which gets you total reserves. And then your kind of guideline is to have $1 million on top of that. And that's like your baseline guideline that you're shooting for in terms of that number on the lower right quadrant of the spreadsheet.
In a normal year under typical circumstances, which maybe haven't existed since COVID. Yes, and we have a new CFO that just came on, and so we'll continue to partner around, like, given the general fund's financial constraints and what's going on in the whole city organization, is there a change to that guidance? But if you look back at old budgets, you'll see, like, we certainly don't want to show zero, right? We want to make sure we're saving for contingency reserves, but that there's additional flexibility where we can have that in that bottom right corner. But
Right.
in general, the goal is program as much of that money as you can, save for contingency reserves, and then maybe have a little bit left.
And that bottom right corner for this year is 16.4. And so that's plenty.
The bottom right of the fund financial in 2031.
Oh, no, 2025 though. I'm just saying we're
Okay, yeah,
projected to have
so
so the fact that we're going to deficit spend for a while isn't great. But to your point, the public expects us to put these resources to use. And so it's not a disaster because you've got a guideline and we're on a glide path to hit the bottom of that guideline. But I just want to make sure I understood that.
I think that's accurate. And it's a valid question, right? Like when we go to executive budget team and we say, hey, things are looking tight. They're like, okay, but you have 16 million. Explain that to us. And I think that the truth and what we were thinking when we created this over the last decade, we had a sales tax increment that was expiring in 2018. We had one we were expecting to expire in 2019. We didn't plan for the community to vote for that extension. It was wonderful that they did after the master plan. And so we ended up with this sort of savings that we intended to carry us through a lot of change that we could then put into master plan tier 1 once the master plan was adopted. So yeah, absolutely. We were intentional in thinking like our revenue picture is going to change. We have additional tax increments changing in the out years. Let's put this money to work during the 10-year master plan implementation horizon. And that's, you see a few of these years we're overspending what we would take in any one given year. So my goal, so 10 years of the master plan is 2029, but even beyond that, I wouldn't want to submit a financial statement that didn't show us returning to spend within our annual revenues. And so we see over the next couple of years, we're outspending our annual revenues using that saved fund balance. And then by 2029, we're returning to our annual spend.
Yeah, thank you. That makes sense. Thank
Yeah.
you.
So thanks, Brady. The great part about going last is that half of your questions have already been asked and answered. So I like the glide path analogy. That's great. So one real specific question is the CIP in uses of funds for the 2025 revised is about $13 million. Did I miss that?
No, it's capital carryover. So there are a couple of things that go into that. A lot of what that is so capital, we budget for a capital project and then it might take 3 years we don't know when permits are going to come through, design phase, when we're going to be able to go to construction. And so some of that money is not spent by December, and so it carries over. And then because of adjustment to base, so through the adjustment to base process, they post last year's unspent capital added to the current year CIP. Okay. So I don't recall off the top of my head what the current year CIP is. I should know that, but it's current year CIP plus unspent monies from the previous year on active projects.
Okay, so
Yeah.
it doesn't represent that we're doing $13 million worth of work in 2025.
No.
It's an accounting function.
Yeah, some of it will be carried forward. I mean, I think permitting is an example. We used to budget a year for permits. Now it could take 18 months to 2 years. It depends. The whole federal climate is changing, right? So we would love to say we're going to finish everything we didn't get done in 2024 plus 2025. That's not realistic. There will be some money in 2025 that we don't spend that will come forward to 26.
Yeah, so in reality, that bulge that we're seeing in this year's revised budget might reappear when we do this again next year.
Yeah, hopefully at a lower level.
At a
Yes,
lower level,
yeah,
right? We're trying
yeah.
to bring it down so that we actually keep things within a fiscal year.
Exactly.
Okay, thanks for that. Another question is around the cost allocations. I mean, it's really, Brady asked a ton of questions on the email about that. Mine is sort of more like the upward glide path, and on this one, it's more of a, to keep in the airline analogy, it's like a 30,000 foot question. We're doubling it from 2.8, little less than 2.8 last year to 5.5 million at the end of this horizon in 2031. So is the notion just that these cost allocations will just always keep going up? You know, we went up because of supply chain issues and, you know, different city accounting processes and stuff, but is it always going to keep going up, do you think?
It's a fascinating question. The presumption is annual growth in terms of the way the model is developed right now. To Dan's earlier comment, like during COVID, when we were cutting budget, the internal service departments were also cutting budget. And so we didn't see huge reductions where they said, oh, never mind, you don't have to pay us for our staff. But we did see slight dips or no growth scenarios where, you know, things were tight. I think one of the things that we can control is how we're accessing services. So there are places in the technology fund, for an example, where it's based on what level of Microsoft Office license and what level of access to software. Those are things where we can potentially tighten the belt, right?
Mm-hmm.
And will that be updated in real time? No, there's usually a lag of 1 to 2 years when they update the model, where they then look at, you know, what our use is of those services. But okay, what's the analysis of seasonal and temp? What do they need for an office suite, right? And can we rethink how we're allocating software instead of everybody has something standard applied to something a little bit more nuanced that helps us save money and then eventually gets reflected in the plan. This is based on current services is the other thing. And so when we think about like centralization efforts or economies of scale, ways that we have people in a bunch of different departments that partner on the same projects, those are things that will get added later. So if for example, we're currently performing a service that then gets centralized into payroll in the finance department, then the payroll cost allocation increases. There should at some point be an offset then of us not performing that service. We just don't know enough at this point to know what those things are going to be and what the real time savings will be for us. But I think if it's updated every 1 to 2 years, that's stuff that then it's a lag for sure, but it would eventually get captured in the plan. But this is based on finance's best understanding right now of what they think growth is going to look like.
And Lauren, correct me if I'm wrong, because you're more the expert on this too. Finance doesn't have the specific understanding of how many FTEs that we may not move forward with in
Correct.
2027, 28, 29. And a lot of the charges are based on headcount. And if we're reducing headcount, that ultimately will should show up in this as well. So, you know, I don't think finance right now has our 2029 plan for staffing. So it's all model, but it will need to be reflected based on headcount when it actually comes down to the charge itself.
So do all of these cost allocations and transfers go back through, you know, the city's general fund to get reallocated, or do they go directly to other departments like city attorney's office, for example? Do we cut a check to the CAO, or does it always go back through the manager?
Yeah, you can correct me if I get this wrong. It's a one-time transfer to the general fund.
Okay.
And then because the general fund builds their, you know, there are many departments competing for general fund dollars. And so when they build their base budgets, so there's this like revenue pot basically, which is all of our transfers in, and then they allocate expenses based off their total revenue, you know, their total cost allocation dollars.
So we're a big time, you know, contributor, because I don't see any line item on the sources of funds where we're taking transfers over and above, we have the sales and use tax, which covers 90% of the budget, but you know, we're putting out $3 million, $4 million, $5 million back to the general fund to fund other departments. So is that an accurate statement?
Yes, and yeah, I mean, yes, we're absolutely a major contributor. We're paying in a lot to cost allocation. We're one of the biggest departments in the city, and we have brought up a few times, well, every time, here are the services that we provide to the general fund, and how do we want to see those reflected? Is it through some sort of transfer in, or is it through negotiation of what the charges are in the actual plan? So I can use an example from police. The rangers are often enough called to serve on encampments and things like that, right?
Yeah.
So we look at the charge PD is giving us, and we say, hey, this doesn't seem to factor in the ranger capacity that we're then lending to PD. Can we negotiate that charge? And most of the time, the answer to that is yes. So we see that in a couple of different ways. Do I think that every single thing we offer to the city is, no, absolutely not.
And does that money that comes back to us appear in intergovernmental revenues?
No.
In that source of funds line item? What's the line item?
It's just a lower
where
cost allocation charge.
It's what?
It's just a lower cost allocation charge than it otherwise would have been. Like it's factored into the model.
So we don't see it. We're just seeing the
You just
net.
don't see it. Yeah, correct.
That's that allocation line items and net.
Yeah.
Okay.
And really, it does not capture everything. I mean, we're not starting a clock when we start to work on non-open space thing. But the big categories, we try to at least make sure we're negotiating with those departments.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, that most of that line of questioning was just to see if we were representing ourselves to the city manager and saying, hey, are we getting anything back for this? And I'm very satisfied that you're doing that. So thank you. And I think I just have, thought I had one more question and then I was done. And so this is the last question. With the acquisition reserve, which is sitting at $4.3 million right now and then drops next year to $1 million, is that just a reallocation of that reserve, or does that reflect the purchase that we recommended tonight?
The latter, and it's not one for one. So our history is before Dan and I got here, the majority of our capital funding any given year was for acquisitions. And then we also had debt issuance. So we had 3 bond issuances during an 8-year span, like right before we got here. And so you had, and it was considered capital. So you had $35 million in capital for acquisitions. But when you consider something capital, it shows as appropriated. So that's appropriated money sitting on your books waiting to be spent. And then when you don't spend it, that creates other accounting concerns. So we spent down most of that, and we made a decision a couple of years ago to take the balance out of CIP and to establish it as an acquisition reserve, saying here's what we think we're going to spend on acquisitions in the next few years. So if approved, the mineral rights acquisition will come out of that $4.3 million. It's not a one, like these were estimates, right?
Sure.
So it was
Yeah.
to say it could be the mineral rights plus one other small acquisition that we
Right,
don't know
right,
is coming
right.
yet. But yeah, so whatever money is approved for a purchase gets appropriated and then reduced from that reserve is how
Okay.
that would work.
Okay,
Yeah.
thanks for all those great
Yeah,
answers
yeah.
and all this great work. Did that spur any other questions or can we talk?
Just one quick question. Is the climate tax, you said we were allocating in our source of funds? I see intergovernmental revenues, to this conversation, those revenues coming in from the city manager's office or from other taxes, are they showing up on sources of funds in one of these buckets or?
No. So
Okay.
because the climate fund is its own fund, it actually has its own financial, like it has its own financial statement showing how much revenue is generated from that tax and then how it's allocated in expenses, which would go to multiple departments, climate initiatives, fire, us. So there is a unique financial statement that covers the entirety of the climate fund, the climate tax. The intergovernmental charges and the transfers here, the one that's coming in right now is for Jefferson County's share of the Lippincott debt for that acquisition. But otherwise, we're not seeing, we handle that through journal entries and transfers in and out of budgets, but it's budgeted for in the climate fund, if that makes sense.
And so the expenses that we have, do they still get reported under operating uses of funds? Even if we're expecting them to somehow be I don't see that reflected in here.
Right. No, you're correct. So this should just be the revenues to the open space fund and the expenses to the open space fund. My caveat there, so for example, the things that are funded by the climate fund are not showing up as expenses on this fund financial. It would be on the climate fund's fund financial. I'll say that in practice, once the budget is approved, what is most common is that we front the costs and then they reimburse us. They then transfer us the money. So, but again, we handle that more through like an accounting mechanism.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so, our obligation as the Open Space Board of Trustees is to make a recommendation to council on your budget, not every single fund budget that you're running. And like you said, Parks and Rec has multiple funds, most of our expenditures and most of our income as a department comes in this main budget, but you do have some other ancillary funds like the climate fund.
Yeah, and when we used to get lottery funds, we actually did have the board make a separate recommendation because we would submit, these are the projects that we're going to do with that money, and we wanted your recommendation on that. With the climate fund, it's been a little bit different, partially because it's new. We don't know yet out of the decision-making bodies what is going to get funded for open space within the climate fund. So if that happens to be decided by July, we would probably put that in the packet for your awareness, but we're not necessarily asking you for a separate recommendation on that.
Okay, thanks,
Yeah.
Lauren. And Cole, you talked a lot, so thank you. No, I'm just kidding. Thank you too for all the work you're doing. Honestly, I know you're helping a bunch.
Yeah.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Okay, so the reason why, and I'm going to kind of go back over what I said earlier, which is, I'd like to see if we have any kind, as a board, if we have any kind of recommendations on how this money should be utilized differently. Let's not make that recommendation next month when we're supposed to be recommending approval of a fully baked budget. I think, if you have any issues in terms of the way that this department is spending its money, then, let's make, let's talk about that right now. And then we can see what comes back in July. So go ahead, Brady.
Okay, thanks. So I've done some slicing and dicing of the cost allocation, largely with Lauren's help, and I have some concerns about how it works and how it affects the integrity of the open space fund of those dedicated tax dollars. I think if the calculation that Lauren recommended was looking at it as a percentage, not of overall budget, but of operating, taking CIP out. And as Dan said, if it truly varies with the number of FTEs, then you would expect that would stay somewhat stable. And we've had some big spikes. We had an 18% spike, a 20% spike, and a 33% spike in the last 10 years. It was flat one year, but it actually went up as a percentage of our operating budget because operating budget went down and it stayed flat. So even though it was flat, it still went up as a percentage. And in the last 10 years, it went down in dollars and as a percentage of ops only once. And then if we look at the projections for the up till 2031, so it will go up to 14.3% of our overall operating budget. So that's every dollar. So in 2016, every dollar of ops, 6 cents went to overhead. In 2031, we're projecting that every dollar of ops, 14 cents will go to overhead. And if you look at it, it goes up, it's just the straight growth goes up 24% in 2027. And then it continues to go up 5%, 5%, 5%, 5% after that. Even though in 2029, our operating budget goes down 3.4%, it still continues that steady march at 5% with absolutely no tie, apparently, to the overall budget. And if you look at it as a percentage of our overall operating, it also continues to climb. So I don't buy it. I don't buy it. And I'm concerned that this is a potential, we're potentially using dedicated tax dollars to fill the gap in other parts of the city. And so, and then, you know, I know it was a kind of last minute request, but I asked for some transparency, like how do you account for it? And apparently previously we had a PDF that could be shared. And now I was told that the full accounting is an elaborate spreadsheet with 500 allocated costs. And to even understand it is going to require me to have a dedicated meeting with the person in the finance department who's overseeing this. That is not transparency. There's no transparency in this right now. I mean, you know, we're diving in to a degree that way more than 99.999% of the citizenry is, and I don't get it. And it's going to require me to have a dedicated meeting, and I'm still kind of a little bit skeptical if I'll even completely understand it. I don't doubt that there's a spreadsheet with 500 allocated costs. I don't doubt that. But the way it just marches forward, not as a function at all of our overall ops, it seems to me, and I don't know if somebody looked at our reserves and said, this is a way we could get everything to balance. So I just want to be clear. These are my impressions that I know it's not perfect because I don't have 100% of visibility in the cost allocations because transfers is in there too. So my calculations might be out by a few fractions of a percent. But I'm hesitant to approve the budget with a part of this march of dedicated open space funds going into a general fund. And remember, this is just the part that we pay to the other parts of the city. That isn't all. We've got our own overhead, if you will. And if you look at every open space central services, everything basically stays flat or fluctuates a little bit.
Right.
The only thing in our 2031 projection that continues a steady march up, it's not fire resilience. It's not maintenance. It's cost allocation. So anyway, so long story short, so what's the answer here? I want to hear what you all think about it. And I also don't know I'm willing to sit down and have a meeting with someone and get a better understanding of it. But within the context of this longer projection, I personally am uncomfortable with this.
Well, this is the question I asked, right? We start at $2.8 million and in 7 years, we're at 5.5, right?
248% increase from 2016 to 2031.
Right. And that, you know, and we heard from Lauren that this is a net. So, you know, we provide services to other departments and then it's a negotiation and we have to advocate for ourselves to get some of this money back that, you know, we spend on other services and other departments. And so I'm with you, Brady, in that I'm also concerned that by putting these numbers in the budget, it's like the classic, you know, the buyer is negotiating with himself. Well, I don't know if the guy who I'm buying this car from would take 10, so maybe I should offer him 11 or maybe 11, but you haven't even made an offer yet and you haven't gotten denied yet. And so if there's so much negotiation involved in netting out what this number is, then does it really behoove us to allow that number on our own budgeting documents to continue to rise at that
That's a
steady
great point.
level
That's
when
a
we're
great
really
point.
kind of negotiating with ourselves before we ever sit down with the city manager and say, hey, we want something back?
Well, and there's no cap either. To me, I mean, like I said, it's like 25% and then 5.5 you know, 20, yeah, so it's gonna be 9%, 25%, almost 5.
Right.
So what's
I mean,
the?
this was the line item that stuck out to me the
Yeah.
most too.
And I know, I'm not an expert. I look at our peer cities, nobody's like this, from what I can see. Others have caps. There's, you know, if you got dedicated funds, there should be some means by which to have transparency and a cap on how much other city departments can, you know, rate it. And again, I understand that, you know, we are part of a city government. I'm not saying that we should think about this just in total isolation, but the way this is trending, the lack of any kind of cap, apparently, I don't know if the city manager can just unilaterally decide, yeah, 2027, 25% increase. Why not? I don't like it.
I do have a comment. Michelle, do you want to comment? Is she okay? Okay. All right. It's sort of like when you have that friend and you go out to dinner and they never buy dinner and you always offer to buy dinner. Or right now we could use, the state of California governor saying, hey, there's a surplus. There's all this conversation about surplus is very real in the discourse. And I do think that we are out on our own. I mean, we're responsible for implementing. We have all of these things that we're supposed to be doing for the city with the city tax. And so it is irresponsible for us to not question why we have this increase. So I completely agree with you. And I have a similar feeling when it comes to resource stewardship. Like up there on the questions on the board, I stopped myself because I kind of am refusing. I'm sort of boycotting the idea of talking about in here, what are we doing with the RAP grants for home hardening? That is not an open space topic. I love that Brian Anaker, thank you for putting the question on. I love the question. I show up and talk at city council meetings and I go sit down with city council on the question of home hardening as Sarah Glenn, not as part of open space. But, and I mean, I will use Brian Anaker as an example. We have staff people in here that are taking on just loads of work for the city on behalf of the city. Fire resilience is a good example. Equity is a good example. And on top of that, to also have this allocation increasing exponentially while we also are spending $3.5–4 million on central services here in this department, that doesn't sit right. It doesn't feel right to me at all. So that's it's a twofold answer, but that's my overall feeling is like we have a friend that is not ever paying for dinner over here.
So let's stick to this cost allocation discussion. I don't know, Brady, if you have any other items, but let's give Michelle a chance to weigh in if she's got something.
Yeah, I guess I'm not seeing the level of, or I'm not experiencing the level of concern that you all are. I mean, this idea that the open space fund is being rated. I mean, I see the open space department but like we're all one city, right? I mean, I hate that we're siloing ourselves like constantly. Well, we're doing this and we're doing that for the city. We are the city. We all have a part to play in our city's initiatives. Yes, we have I don't know, a huge footprint of the land that actually makes up the city of Boulder. And we play a part in things like equity because that is something that the department cares about. That's something that the city cares about. That's something that everybody cares about. Wildfire, that's something that everybody plays a part in. I don't know that anybody's coffers are being raided for the purpose of cost allocation. We use a lot of resources. I know just in the last couple of years, we used a lot of CAO time removing a board member. Like, that's not really something we all plan to, but we used a lot of time for that. And we use a lot of the HR systems because we onboard 100 youth rangers every summer. This is something that these are services that we use, developing a method over the last couple of years to have a method and not have it be completely negotiable, every single year, I think is a step forward. So I'm not really feeling the level of concern that you all are. I don't think that people are pushing unnecessary expenses to the open space. I see us using a lot of resources, and this is the way that you have to allocate these things. I've been on the other side of this exercise.
Michelle, how do you account for the fact that it continues to go up as a percentage of our operating budget consistently? I mean, I agree. Of course, we're all one city. Of course, there are costs that need, and I understand also there's complexity, you know, maybe cybersecurity and other things are just, you know, are more expensive than they were 10 years ago. However, the fact that it continues to march up, not just going up but going up as a percentage of our, maybe I'll just share the little back of the envelope spreadsheet with you. And it over time, going from 6% to 14%, irrespective of what's going on with the operating budget, just, to me, it doesn't make sense. And I'm having a hard time, you know, again, I don't disagree with your statement, but I'm having a hard time understanding why. And if we continue, if we just kind of play this out, you know, what is 30%? We're going to hit 30% in 2040? Like, where does it end?
I mean, it goes to the way I view it, it goes to the question that I asked earlier. What percent is the open space operating budget relative to the city? Like, that's one way to measure. Like, does that actually pass muster? Like, you know, we have a huge operating budget, so it would make sense. You know, I know you're doing it based on FTE. And I know that's muddied because we actually employ a lot of seasonal and temporary employees, and there's an allocation that's made on that head count as well. But like the percentage of the overall city's budget, because then you're all accounting for the price increases, right? Everybody's experiencing similar price increases, although ours probably because we have so many like hard goods related to soil, I don't know, bringing in soil or concrete or things like that. We might be a little bit more sensitive to those costs. Um, but I do see on the like system side, we demand a lot of like project management software, onboarding software, things like that. But I guess that's how I reconcile that, Brady, is by looking at the percentage of the overall city budget.
Okay, well, you know, I think that the overall city budget would have to be cut in half while our budget stays the same for it to account for a doubling of our contributions through transfers and cost allocations, and that just isn't happening. So, you know, I guess my position here is that I would ask, and I think, you know, this may be where you're going, Brady, just that we reconsider the projection. You know, it seems like in terms of, and you know, if this is something where, you know, I'm woefully undereducated on this because there's a 500-line spreadsheet that I have no access to and have never looked at. But I think that as a board, at least the three of the four of us tonight are saying we don't want necessarily to negotiate with ourselves and keep running this number up on that ladder 2 rungs a year the way it's going, and you know, maybe put some different inputs into the spreadsheet and see what you come up with. Does that sound like where you're thinking, Brady, before we let Lauren
I
respond?
think I mean, somebody, I think it was Charlotte in the city finance department offered to meet, and I'm out of the country for the next 2 weeks, so hopefully I can meet with her before the next meeting. But so I'm willing to do that. And yeah, it sounds like 3 of us are in alignment on this issue. I guess I'd also like to understand, like, what recourse do we have? Is it the sort of thing where the city manager just makes the call and that's just the way it is? So I'm really just flagging this and just to let everybody know that I'm uncomfortable with the trend.
But being uncomfortable isn't giving direction. And
Well, so education is my first step, right? Because I know I don't know a lot of things.
I mean, we're not supposed to direct.
And bringing the city council's attention to this, that we, you know, one of our only purposes is to approve disposals and to talk about the budget. And in my experience, we don't have a whole lot of, you know, we say, oh, we don't like this CIP thing and blah, 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 but we haven't ever said, wait a second. there's something fundamentally at issue that we need to look at. And maybe we'll look at it in a systematic way and come away and say, oh, sure enough, it makes sense. But so that's it.
Right, but I'm uncomfortable with, the decision of this board and the recommendation of this board coming down to, what you learn when you sit down with the spreadsheet. I want to give some guidance tonight. And that guidance isn't to lower the number. That guidance is to look at it and decide whether, we are in fact, being overly generous in negotiating with ourselves, or whether we can trim that going forward.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good recommendation. I also think that just, it's been part of my education. And I think part of the way that, in my opinion, I think the way that city boards generally interact with the budget is highly variable from board to board. Again, this is a little off the subject. I think council or somebody should look at it and standardize it and give us more direction. And make sure that we're clear about what our charge is, because it's based on language that's really old. We're supposed to recommend a budget to the city council. What does that mean? Well, we're trying right now. So I also think there's some vagary in our charge in some ways. And so maybe that's why my recommendation isn't as crisp as the one you just came up with, which I could get behind.
I would add to I think that what I would like to ask, I think we need to actually ask. I'd like to have a budget where we're asking for as much as we can possibly receive from the city for the things that are important to this department, for the things that we foresee being new and important as we're growing and changing with everything that's going on, budget restraints included, not just fire resilience, but the whole thing. And then also, I would like for us to say no wherever we can to the city. So it's just, I think if that, the recommendation is to go, my recommendation would be to go, and I'm looking over here because I'm like, is that getting close? I'd like some staff feedback on what we're talking about too. But yeah, does that feel more concrete? That's more what I'm thinking. I'd like to see I want to know, what is the city giving us? And I want to know, what are we giving the city? And I want it to be really transparent, and I want to know why. And I just want it to be this intentional thing. And I want to make sure that we aren't over giving unnecessarily at our own detriment into the future.
I think we're talking about, when we talk about this line item of transfers and cost allocations, we already heard from staff that it's a net, right? So this builds in all the things like, extra services that we provide to the police department, and we get a cost allocation that comes back from them. So the net is that this year we're $3.3 million going out the door. We don't know whether that's 8 million going out the door and 4.7 coming back for a net of 3. We don't. That's the transparency. I'm not sure I need that transparency. I'm just, my concern here is just that, and I'll keep saying it, just that we don't sort of negotiate with ourselves. And if we're actually doing that, maybe we shouldn't. And if they're, if staff can say, look, there are 512 good reasons why this is the number we came up with, and all of them are kind of hard and set in stone, and it's not a matter of negotiating with ourselves. These are real. I don't think they are, because I think looking out to 2031, nothing's real. It's all estimates. And so I'm just concerned with the message that we're sending, that, we're an ever increasing, exporter of dollars to the rest of the city. And I think that's what Brady picked up on.
Maybe one request, or I don't know if this is guidance, but would be more transparency around this. And a specific question: why does it keep going up as a function of operating costs? Why doesn't it float roughly with operating costs? And is it equitable across other departments? I think that would be context.
What are we getting for this?
Well, I actually think the what are we getting for this maybe gets a little bit at Michelle's us and them point. And I don't want there to be an us and them. I suspect that it's the city's it's a government. It's a burgeoning bureaucracy. We keep growing and having more expenses, and it trickles down, and the dedicated open space dollars are paying for that. And again, I know things get more expensive over time in some cases, and this is a city that expects a lot of services. And yet, what is the justification for that going up, not as a function of the size of our
Well,
department.
that's what I mean. Not, yeah, not what are we getting, but actually what is this allocation going towards that benefits this department? How is it justified? So that's, I mean, that's that's what transparency is. And it is a transaction. We're talking about tax dollars are coming into the city. They're getting allocated. We have to do what we're supposed to do with them. And so the transactional piece, that transparency comes from that. I just wanted to take a minute since I said, what are we getting? And I didn't want that to get blown out of proportion.
Is this a good time to get staff's feedback on, it doesn't have to be a formal recommendation. What do you think of this conversation we're having up here?
Yeah, well, that's a big question. I think.
And what I mean by what do you think isn't like, is it fun? I mean, is this
No,
something you're wanting to look into, or do you have good reasons to stick with the numbers that you've shown us, which clearly have caused some consternation?
No, I think that there's a ton of value in the conversation. So I think I would start by saying I respect all of your opinions on it and your service and your knowledge. And so this is really useful as we think about how we want to go and work with our colleagues in other departments. Dan and I have been here 10 years, and Molly Davis, who was a former board chair, she would vote against the budget every year and then pull me aside and say, it's not, you did great. It's cost allocation. And you're not going to hurt our feel. Or that is an option that you all have available to you, and you as public, as volunteers and servants on this board, absolutely have that option. I think I view our role as I want to get you the right information to inform your recommendation, whatever you decide that recommendation should be. We've also seen in the past when there have been yes votes on the budget that there's a narrative attached that goes into the council packet where it explains your concerns. And so I think that remains an option for you as well. Some of this about negotiation is homework for us to go back and talk about. So I've mentioned the cost allocation plan gets, updated, negotiated every 2 to 3 years. We just went through it last year. So I don't believe that there's an intention on the finances work plan to really look at the 2026 numbers in terms of like, let's reopen the whole thing and look at the line item charges. I have no idea without talking to Charlotte what the level of openness is, right? And I think that's, Dan and I have been taking notes, and we would be taking that back to talk to finance in the city manager's office. I can certainly raise the question and pass along the high level points from this conversation. But as of now, I don't, you can comment too. I think they consider what we locked in last year to be kind of a 2-year plan.
Yeah, I would echo that. I would also say a couple of things to formulate what you might want to do next month is, next month you're making a recommendation on the 2026 budget, not necessarily the 2031 proposed budget, where some of the big concerns Brady raised. So just looking at the difference between 25 and 26 in cost allocation, what I'm hearing is I think the concerns might be, it's maybe not so sure what the concern between 25 and 26. So what statement do you might want to attach to the 2026 budget in regards to the trend past the 2026 budget? So,
well, in terms of the 2026 budget specifically, if I'm reading it correctly, our ops goes down by 0.6%. And our cost allocation goes up by 9%. Huh. Why? Why did we tighten our belt and what we're paying to the central services went up by 9%? Why is that? Because our FTE count went down? That doesn't make any sense. Unless there are things going on that we don't understand, which clearly there are. But that would be one question.
And another, just to follow up on that is, yeah, I get that we're recommending approval or not of the 26 budget, but do these numbers that go out to 31 get shared as part of that budget that goes to council? So I am concerned about the message that sends. If anybody's actually paying attention to the line items, that if we're projecting out 5 additional years and the cost allocation, as Brady says, just doesn't have a cap, it just keeps going up, is that a message that as a department we want to send?
And Brady, I guess I'll just, at the end, you were starting to actually come up with a very specific question that might be an informational request back to staff. So you almost got there.
Okay, this might be a good one if it's helpful. So my reading is that our operating budget is going to go down by 0.6%, give or take. And my reading of this sheet is that our cost allocation will go up by 9%. Why is that? and the extent to which we can get transparency to that beyond having to sit down with someone and go through 500 lines on a spreadsheet. I think that isn't best practice when it comes to budgeting transparency, especially when we're talking about restricted dedicated funds that the citizenry is taxing themselves for open space. And this is happening, and there's no light on this at all. Nobody knows except for those of us who turned the PDF into a spreadsheet and dorked around with it for 20 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, I think what we could do is we could formulate a couple of questions and provide it to finance staff and see if we could, and be happy to forward a response we get back from them.
Yeah, and you know, if there's a way of trimming some of those numbers and you come back to us with a proposed budget, you know, the 2031 number looks different in July's meeting, you know, great. If not, I think, you know, having an explanation would be a really good idea. And I think we can, you know, either vote our conscience on that, or we can attach, you know, some sort of an additional resolution of the board that we want to go along with our recommendation.
One last thought. I know we're going late. I would like it to not be, this is just for the board, I would like this to not be a kind of throwaway protest vote if we vote it down. You know what I mean? Like, I didn't know there's some board chair who always voted it down. I mean, I'd actually like us to look at this deeply and as a result of this, for the citizenry to understand what's going on, and for us to have a real discussion about it. And I'm not saying I know what the answer is.
Yeah, I agree. And I think we're having a real
okay,
discussion about it right now. So for this particular line item on cost allocation and transfers, I don't feel the need to, you know, make some kind of formal motion or recommendation to staff. You know, I think they've heard us. Do you agree? Okay, Michelle, are you good with where we're leaving this for this line item? I think you were heard. I heard you for sure. And 3 other people had their say.
Yep.
Okay, so are there any other line items that anybody else wants to discuss around the budget? Or can we close this part of the hearing? That was it? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Put in one because we have another guest here tonight, and this is a very short presentation, and then we could check in about what we want to do. But the executive director of the Boulder Open Space Conservancy is here, and as part of the budget.
She's been patiently waiting.
And I think she's got about a 5 to 7 minute presentation, so it won't be too long.
Okay, shall we vote to continue this, to keep going on this meeting after 9 o'clock, open a new matter? Yes? Yes.
No.
Are we opening up a couple of new matters?
I was suggesting that we have our guests do her presentation, and then we look at whether or not we want to suspend the meeting at that point and forward the rest of the stuff for another meeting.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, well, I'll vote yes because no, just for this next item. Okay.
Okay.
We're
So
going to
with
vote
that,
yes for this item.
Janelle Freeston, Jeff Haley will introduce our Allison, and we'll do a very brief presentation. Thank you. Okay. Small.
All right, here we go. I'm going to be kicking this off tonight, and we're really proud to be here for the annual Boulder Open Space Conservancy update. And as you know, they're our 501c3 official partner. And especially when we just heard about budgets, it's more important than ever that we have this public-private partnership. And it's been 8 years in the making now, Allie. It's amazing. And just wanted to do a couple more context setting. Jeff and I serve as ex officio members of BOSC, and then Allison Duffy, who is here, is the executive director. So I will be handing it to her in just a few more slides. So great, we can do next slide. Great, and so yeah, we're gonna just very quickly go over the history of BOSC and how it all got started. And then Allie will be sharing the perspective from BOSC and what they've been working on and their successes. Then Jeff is going to talk a little bit about some of the OSMP partnership sponsorship needs that we have looking forward. And then we have saved some time for questions. So next slide. So this fun photo, raise your hand if you were at the OSMP 50th celebration. Yeah, great. Almost 10 years ago now. This was a fun day, and this is the day that we also honor the beginning of BOSC. And it was a fun event, and I also want to make note that Oakley Thorne, who is on the left-hand side in the green hat, he was one of the instrumental founders of the open space program and the passage of the sales tax in 1967. So really excited about that. And since that event, what we've been doing over the last 8 years, we have MOUs and project charters that have been put in place to officially allow for BOSC to fundraise on our behalf and to help leverage funds and to put on events. And Allie will be sharing more about that. And the next slide. And then, as was mentioned in the memo, more than ever again, BOSC is helping to serve many master plan strategies, but particularly financial sustainability. And one thing I want to make note of is that it was a really exciting moment back in March. They gifted us with over $60,000, and that was what they raised in 2024. And because wildfire was brought up a couple times tonight, 12,000 of that 60,000 will be put towards some of these wildfire resilient efforts. So yeah, really exciting. And then also some towards the connecting youth to nature and responsible recreation, as well as resilient landscapes. So we're really excited about that partnership. And now next slide, I'm going to pass it over to Allie to share some more.
I'm so excited to be here. Thank you. As we're all aware, Boulder is a national and international travel destination spot for millions of tourists, students, athletes, and more people each year. And like me, hundreds of thousands of folks and families over the years have moved here because of the world-class parks and trails that really make this place so special. As we know, the public lands and trails in Boulder that OSMP manages see more than 6 million visits each year. For perspective, this is more than the number of visits our neighbors at Rocky Mountain National Park have each year, and also more than Yellowstone National Park. Each park sees around 4 million visits each year. To drill that perspective down even a little bit more, Rocky Mountain has about 265,000 acres of land to manage and 359 miles of trails. Yellowstone has 2 million acres of land and 1,100 miles of trails. As we know, Boulder has 155 miles of trails and 46,000 acres of open space. So we have 2 million visits utilizing a lesser amount of space, about 15 to 20% of what Rocky Mountain has. So we're being acutely impacted, consistently utilized. Just like our national parks neighbors have a nonprofit partner to support the park with fundraising, public education, and stewardship initiatives, thankfully, Boulder has little old BOSC. What's exciting is there is so much room for our growth and opportunities to better support our public lands and the department that manages them. Next slide, please. BOSC, oh, this is, can you actually advance one and then we're going to go back to that one? Thank you. BOSC goals for 2025 to support OSMP. Increase funds raised by 17% to support OSMP projects in 2026. Note, this is a very conservative goal. We will continue to raise funds to support Mount Sanitas, the Junior Rangers, and critical climate resilience projects. We are developing our board and increasing board capacity. This next one is not on this slide, but we are securing our 3-month operating reserve. We will host complimentary community cultivation events that I will talk about in just a few minutes. We will work closely with OSMP on the sponsorship program, partner on grants, and private giving for important projects. Okay, back one slide, thank you. Since 2021, we have had great success and have raised approximately $150,000 for one of our crown jewels, Mount Sanitas. If you hike at Mount Sanitas, you may have seen these posters in a couple of spots on the trails. We worked with OSMP to design these posters. A couple $1,000s came in when those posters were new in 2023. We mainly raised funds through appeal campaigns, corporate sponsors, events, and matching grants. Next slide. Yes, thank you. Because we have had success with Mount Sneedus, we expanded our partnership last year to include many other OSMP projects that we have organized under these themes or pillars. The pillars and representative projects are explained on our website, bosc.org. As Janelle mentioned, last year we raised $60,000 in donations designated for OSMP projects from the community and from visitors, which was a 25% increase from the donations raised for OSMP the year before. Beyond our generous Boulder community, Bosc sees supporters make gifts of donation from California, Illinois, New York, Florida, Connecticut, New Jersey, and Oregon, just to name a few states. Next slide, please. So I could really go for one of those right now. How about you? So how are we inspiring stewardship from the community and from visitors? Various fun ways. Bosc partners with local businesses to encourage volunteerism and sponsorships of donation or in-kind services or goods. We've collaborated with breweries on these special beer releases. We have our logo actually on that Everyday Mountain Pills can. And we've collaborated with outdoor gear companies, with banks, and with other companies. And there's so much more room to grow there. Next slide, please. Here's a unique event that Bosc created called Full Moon Jazz that's gaining popularity each year. So save the date now for Full Moon Jazz, Sunday, September 7th. I'll be sending out emails about that.
I went last time and it was really cool. Sorry to interrupt you, but I loved it.
Yes, good. It's a magical event. Thank you. Next slide, please. And here are a few photos from our spring garden party that our board chair hosts in her backyard, or this year was in her family room because a storm rolled through. And you'll recognize some of the fine folks in some of these photos. Our guests really enjoyed talking with Dan and Jeff and learning more about our partnership and work. We also gave my good friend Oak Thorne, there he is again, a Bosc Legacy Award for his 6 decades long leadership and service to fighting for the preservation of open space in Boulder. Next slide, please. We have so many opportunities for growth. We will continue to expand awareness of Bosc in the community, build our corporate program through volunteerism and sponsorship donations. These are pictures from REI Volunteer Days. Keep building our strong foundation of supporters, and the work never ends, and in fact it is increasing, so we need to be nimble and keep evolving with the needs of the land, the needs of the department, and the needs of our community. Next slide, please. I have these Bosc cards with a QR code for you to take and share and learn more or make a donation, as I see Brady is doing right now. Yes. And I also brought a few of these super sweet Bosc hats for anyone who would like one tonight. And now Jeff will talk about the partnership perspective from the department.
I'm just going to be really brief. And as you can tell, the reason we added this agenda item to this meeting is because we had the robust budget update and discussion that you all just had. And you can go to the next slide, Leah. And we thought it's really helpful the community can see, you know, we recognize there's needs and there are really great opportunities with Allison and the Bosc board to really help support the department. And a lot of times we hear, well, why does open space need money? Like, what's the need? Like, aren't you well funded? Don't we vote for sales taxes, et cetera? And so a lot of times we'll show this graph that's part of our budget documents that, just like we talked a minute ago, over the last several years, you can see those orange lines are capital maintenance. The majority of our capital funding is maintenance, taking care of what we have. Some capital enhancement as well. Enhancements aren't brand new shiny things. It's basically taking care of existing assets, but trying to make them a little bit better. Just like a wooden bathroom at a trailhead that burns down, we'll replace it with a concrete one so next time it doesn't burn, for example. So that's an enhancement. But that's the lion's share of our capital program. And so we can't necessarily meet all those needs like Dan discussed earlier with all the plan implementation and all the great projects the community has asked for. You can go to the next slide. So we talk about our asset management. We talk about our assets are always in need. We have historical high rain events, extreme weather events that we're dealing with, not to mention all the high visitation and all the stats that Allison mentioned at the beginning of just the impact on our system. And so we do robust asset management. We know inventory of our assets, what condition they're in. We know what needs to be done, but as you all just described and spent time talking about, we don't necessarily always have the money to pay for it. So Leah, you can go to the next slide. But Sanitas, again, is a prime example that we've been pointing to. You've heard about it a lot, so I won't share all that, but we did get the $1.2 million grant. And I would really point to BOSC for helping out on that with a lot of work and support as we applied and were successful. And so that was and we now have a very targeted campaign to continue that, to match the grant funds, to really seek support and show the community, like, here's exactly where those dollars are going. She showed the cards and the posters out there, like, hey, as you're enjoying your hike, as you're climbing, as whatever you're doing, feel free and think about helping out. So the last slide too, not only this, but we're looking at really improving our sponsorship opportunities. And we talk about sponsorship in the sense of being a little more intentional, a little more specific and coordinated about giving the community opportunities that they can give, not just general support open space, but for example, Marshall Mesa Trailhead. A lot of these 3D renderings are for some of our current projects. And it's not just infrastructure. It can, we're supporting, again, the ecological resource stewardship projects, youth and nature projects. But thinking about the work we're doing now is thinking about how can we give donors, give sponsors really targeted campaigns and opportunities to give, demonstrating the need specifically of where that money will go. And then also how can we recognize those donors or how can we fulfill those sponsorships more effectively through different means on our system. So that's kind of our approach. I was really brief just so we can get through this stuff. I know it's getting late. We did have a few questions, if you go to the next slide, teed up. And this was kind of for Allison. We kind of brainstormed on just to kind of inspire some thought and feedback. Again, it's late, but you know, thinking about if you guys have any questions for Allison or the BOSC board. Are there additional opportunities you see between OSBT and BOSC? And then the last question, are there other opportunities that we could capitalize on more or kind of stretch, extend the reach of BOSC? So thank you.
Thank you, Jeff.
Yeah.
And thanks, Allison. And thanks, Janelle. It's fantastic. And appreciated your garden party a lot and meeting Oak and having my son meet him because he'd gone to the Thorn Nature experience. And what a cool bunch of stories Oak told about the old days and the beginning of open space in Boulder County and the city of Boulder. It's just awesome. So in terms of questions, I'd like to go to Michelle first in case, because I haven't gone to her first yet and she's out there. Michelle, do you have any questions?
No, thank you. I'll email them if something comes up though.
Okay. Any questions or comments?
Well, you're on the board, Sarah, so thank you for that. And I have a lot of fundraising experience. And so I'd like to help. I feel like in an organization like this, the ability to tell a story about what would be possible that we couldn't do otherwise, whether that's, you know, getting an extra staffer that's paid for or some kind of capital campaign, you know, that gap between what could be and what is, and capitalizing on that and figuring out where to differentiate between philanthropic versus the tax base seems to me to be the kind of crucial part of the storytelling. I'm sure I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but anyway, those are just some things that occur to me. And
Great.
Thank you for waiting through the kind of long budget discussion and still being here with us. So thank you.
You're welcome.
I am brand new to the board of BOSC, but I really have enjoyed so far participating, and the community is really, really beautiful. I think I'll take this moment to say that Susan Schaefer, who's also on the board of BOSC, was one of the people who were injured during the walk a couple of weeks ago here in Boulder during the peaceful protests. And as horrible as that is, what I noticed right away was that BOSC, there was a little circle that came around her, and it was another node for her. her participation on Bosque and throughout the city, she got to kind of be held and reflected back from the people of Bosque. So I think now is a really, I've been talking about money all night, so I'm going to shift and talk about the community aspect of this. I think it's a really, really fun and important way for us to be building the community that we have around open space and our shared love for these lands and the peace that we can find up there.
Well, thank you so much for coming, and I appreciate all the efforts, and look forward to your continued success and participation and partnership with us.
Thank you. I appreciate that so much, and your support means so much. A couple years ago it was a very different tune, so I'm so excited to be working with you. My email is Allison, ALYSON @bosque.org. Brady, when you get back, we'll meet to talk fundraising. Sarah and I are going to be talking too. So thank you.
Oh, that's great. Okay.
Thanks, Allison. Thanks, Janelle.
Okay,
Thanks,
so
Jeff.
we have two more items that are budgeted for 15 and 10 minutes before director verbal updates. If we were to hold a vote to see if we were going to hear these items starting after 9 o'clock, how would folks? Brady's a no.
We've checked in with the staff and we are okay bumping these till July.
Okay.
If we can support them in July. So
Okay.
we're good to go on our end. And just a big shout out to Tess and Eileen, who have probably been patiently waiting to present.
I
But
see
you
you
get to
out
come
there.
back and
I
listen
see
to us
you out
again.
there. Oh, I'm so sorry.
But yeah, we'll come back.
Okay. And Dan, did you have anything for your short matter?
I'll email out the ones I was going to meet. So.
Okay. Well, then I'm going to adjourn the meeting.
Given that we had that tech problem at the beginning, it's not actually